Old versus new. Gorilla Mode has been upgraded, and this is our flagship pre-workout released almost half a decade ago at this point. It's pretty crazy to think. 2019, I still remember fondly before Halloween pressing publish on the breakdown video of this formula. And this was, in my opinion, revolutionary at the time for being one of the only formulas probably in the industry to feature transparent labeling without proprietary blends, not falsely inflate product potency claims with misleading ingredients like citrulline malate at 8 grams, when in reality the actual citrulline content is 2/3 of that. Just purposefully using full-blown L-Citrulline separately from Malic Acid and listing Malic Acid with the actual amount. Simultaneously using maximum efficacious dosages backed by human-based literature. Like, this formula has stood the test of time, and it's been a banger since 2019. But it's time for an upgrade. It's been a minute. So not just in formula though, too, in actual flavor quality, overall standardization, mixability, among other things. So, and we'll get into all that. As you can see by the length of the video, this is not going to be concise. So if you have seen, I actually did a concise video on the Gorilla Mind YouTube channel months ago, but this video needed to go on the More Plates, More Dates channel with the full detail. Like, this is gonna be a long one, boys. So, you know, over the past 2 years, we've been slowly tweaking the formula behind the scenes, testing new iterations, developing new, better and standardized flavor systems. We're finally done the upgrades, and it's time to transition to new Gorilla Mode 2.0. It's not officially called 2.0, but I'm just referring to it as that so you can see the difference in the videos. So 2.0, what changed and why? So in 2019, this represented what I believe to be the pinnacle of pre-workout formulas relative to what else was on the market at the time. You can even see in my enthusiasm in the video, like I was very, very passionate about what we had put together here. And in 2019, you know, I think that was my first 1+ hour formula breakdown video I ever published on my channel. And, you know, it's kind of crazy. It's been half a decade already since then. I'll put a card up so you can watch that if you want to check it out. But to this day, this is still a great formula, and we literally had tens of thousands of reviews come in for this product since launch, and, you know, it's been overwhelming and awesome. And I have to thank you guys mostly for that, honestly, because it's like, this is ultimately what started it all, is this channel and that video, probably, for the most part, and us, you know, believing in this formula and trying it and liking it. So to this day, you know, great formula. However, as many of you know who are subscribed to me for a while now, you know, I'm always trying to educate myself similar to you guys and doing my best to innovate by integrating anything new that I learn and feel worthwhile into formula changes, you know, as we go on. It's not like this was always going to be the same formula in perpetuity. If I learn more things, you know, I would hope that you would also hope that I would then integrate that into subsequent changes in the future. So expectedly, you know, in 5 years, a lot has changed, new literature has emerged, and interpretations of existing literature have changed, and I've learned a lot. You know, I've educated myself a lot since we launched this back in 2019. So, and we've got a lot of feedback since 2019 too. Like I said, tens of thousands of reviews. When we launched Mode initially, the sample size was small. Like, it was me, my buddies, some people that I had beta tested, using the existing literature, but ultimately it was using like a very small sample size of this, of what would be the outcome with this specific combination of ingredients. Like, we didn't really know for sure. I had a pretty strong idea given, you know, the anecdotes and the internal feedback and all that and the literature it was based on, but ultimately I didn't know for sure that everyone would love it the way they did. But over the years, it's been hugely successful. And I have a huge bank of feedback that I've been able to pull from for years at this point. Like I said, tens of thousands of reviews, and those reviews assimilated into the changes that made it into here. You know, taking the overall feedback as well as the things I've learned and things I can integrate, and developed what I think is the ultimate upgrade that I could conceive of that was actually worth doing. And I'll explain why it was even worth doing, because obviously if something's good, like don't mess with it is what you would think. But there was a lot of things that made this worthwhile that I'll dig into in elaborate detail. So like, as you can imagine, as a company gets bigger, the more time intensive and expensive a pivot on a formula actually is. When you have, I think at one point we had nearly 20 flavors of this product. So you can just imagine the amount of money that goes into the inventory that's sitting there, and then trying to figure out how to like transition out of the old formula into the new one and still have, you have residual units of the old one while you're pivoting into the new one. Like, it logistically, it's a nightmare. Capital, it's also a nightmare. So it has to be a very worthwhile pivot to actually make it make sense at this scale. So logistically, it was difficult to phase out, you know, not being understocked while still meeting demand, but also not being overstocked. The Formula 1 and Formula 2 comes in. And, you know, the seamless transition was, you know, as you would expect, not easy, but I felt worthwhile. So here we are now, and it's done, and I'm happy we trudged our way through and made it to the other side with this bad boy, 2.0. So culmination of what is almost half a decade of learning, over a year of deliberate formula tweaking, flavor updates, stability testing, countless other factors, and I'm proud to present this to you guys, 2.0, the next generation of Gorilla Mode pre-workout. And here are the changes summarized before we get into the supplement facts breakdown, and then subsequent to that, the extreme detailed dissection. So what has changed just from 1 to 2 overarchingly? So the max dose, as you know, 2 scoops is the max dose that you would take in a 24-hour period, went from 30 grams per 2 scoops to 40 grams of ingredients in the new formula. So Mode, as you can see, literally comes in a bigger tub. And we are essentially at our capacity for active ingredients without transitioning to like a tub like this. So I actually didn't even think of that at the time until we actually arrived there, where there is actually a cap whereby you couldn't kitchen sink a formula. You have to be pretty mindful about what you're allocating each gram of active ingredient space to, because if you aren't careful, you end up in the territory of not only is it impossible to tolerate from your digestive system because there's just too much sheer powder, but in addition, you have a tub like this, which is just like, nobody's going to use this for pre-workout. So the change, the first notable thing is overall active ingredients went up substantially, right up to the capacity that we could within a tub size that is still like in the sphere of pre-workout-esque without getting into like protein powder level territory. And like, I've seen some nonsense before included to inflate the perceived potency / value of pre-workouts, and this is not that. Like, every ingredient had a deliberate inclusion. It wasn't there just to make it beefed up and like look like a bigger tub, like, oh, look at this extra value. Like, there was reasons for everything being added, which I'll get into soon. So the formula updates are based on the most recent literature, over 1 million orders, user feedback, notably the areas of the formula that have been tweaked the most: markedly increased energy, focus, drive, stress resilience, pump, power, and overall performance. All vectors I consider the most worthwhile, short of becoming like a literal protein powder tub, have been augmented accordingly to the maximum capacity that I felt worthwhile and could physically do. S-tier flavor systems. You know, for some people that might be the biggest upgrade actually, is the flavors are so much better now. Really, really excellent, and I'm stoked with how they came out. Also, naturally colored. You guys might have nostalgia for the like, what would you even call this? Like swamp water looking mixture that was Gorilla Mode 1.0. Every single flavor looked the same in terms of the murky ass swamp water look that was not visually appealing, but we would slug it down and it worked great. We actually have natural colors now. So there's no artificial colors making, you know, reds or blues or anything. Rather, we have natural colors that actually are, you know, there's no health ramifications of natural colors, and they still look awesome and there is absolutely some level of like effect that you get psychologically from drinking something that is corresponding to the flavor and color, and just like the feel you get from it is more pleasant overall, and it's just a nice addition. So I was happy that we were able to make that work, because I wasn't sure if it was possible with a formula this potent with natural colors, because if the natural colors didn't work, we weren't going to go the artificial colors route, but it did work. Better mixability and less clumpy and gritty, despite the fact that there is more active ingredients. Now, notably, you have to use more water though. So the formula literally has more actives. So if having like a powder heavy formula isn't your preference, just be aware that if you're used to mixing 2 scoops of pre-workout in like 10 ounces of water or something, because your typical pre-workout that you drink can actually be diluted adequately in that amount, like the same is not to be said with Gorilla Mode, the most stacked version of this formula that we could conceive. And even compared to this, like this was already, you need to mix with quite a bit of water, but this one is like substantially more powder, therefore you need more water. So if you're somebody who, is going to be like, oh, it's too chalky, it's too this, it's too potent, the mixability is markedly better than this. And I would be shocked if anybody told me otherwise. Like, it mixes incredibly well, much better than the previous iteration, less gritty and clumpy, but you will need to absolutely use a bit more water than normal if you are somebody who doesn't want as heavy of a pre-workout, because the sheer amount of powder is starting to get a little bit arduous. Well, first of all, I would try just diluting more. You might need to do like 8 to 14 ounces of water per scoop, depending on your desired flavor level. So like worst case scenario, you might be filling up a shaker cup to the max to do 2 scoops of this. But I typically do like, a bit more than half a shaker cup for 2 scoops of this, and because I like really intense flavors, but it's kind of up to your own preference there. But just be aware, like, dilution is necessary with this much powder. And if you find that it is a little bit heavy for you in terms of amount of powder, that is where going with our more refined base offering might be worthwhile. So you guys might or might not be aware, because I didn't do a video about it, but Gorilla Mode Base is kind of like the bare bones version of Gorilla Mode. So Gorilla Mode Base has kind of like the foundational infrastructure of the formula via the NO precursor component, one of the main osmolytes being betaine anhydrous, and the kind of like anti-homocysteine, anti-NO inhibitory pathway. Has a heavy dopamine precursor dose. L-Tyrosine still has malic acid, citrulline at the topped out amount, has some cholinergics in there, has a heavy hit of caffeine. But this is like the bare bones formula that is kind of like cost effective, newbie friendly, no creatine in it. It's not the maxed out formula this is, it's the bare bones one, but it's very, very easy on the stomach and digestive system if you just want like a clean, and of course, expectedly, this tasted the best of all the pre-workouts. Not that this one isn't already like as close to a 10 out of 10 as you can get, but ultimately, if you have the lighter pre-workouts are going to be easier to flavor because there's less actives to mask. This is like the best tasting iteration of our flavor systems now, which match the new ones in here. So it's exceptional. These are like the 10 out of 10s, and these are like 9 out of 10, given the amount of powder. But yeah, like if you want something that's light on the stomach, a bit more cost effective, kind of like the base formula, kind of like the essentials, that's where you would look to Gorilla Mode Base. Don't go get, some shitty fucking Cellucor C4 or something. So we got you covered, even if you want like the lighter, more entry-level type pre now, which is cool because we didn't have that before. All right, so back to the formula. So those are the main things, better flavors, better mixability. The powder quality is even superior, like the grittiness and whatnot. Actives significantly higher now. And all of the main vectors, pump, performance, focus, energy, all heightened. Now let's talk about the formula. So the Gorilla Mode 2.0 formula. Per 2 scoop dose, niacin as niacinamide, 32 milligrams. Vitamin B6 as P5P, pyridoxal 5-phosphate, the methylated format of B6, 20 milligrams. Vitamin B12 as methylcobalamin, methylated B12, 250 micrograms. Magnesium as magnesium bisglycinate, 50 milligrams. Sodium coming from pink Himalayan sea salt, 380 milligrams with a hit of chloride on top. Potassium as potassium chloride, 380 milligrams. L-Citrulline, 10,000 milligrams. Creatine Monohydrate, 5,000 milligrams. L-Tyrosine, 5,000 milligrams. Betaine Anhydrous, 4,000 milligrams. Hydroprime glycerol powder, 4,000 milligrams. Malic acid, 3,000 milligrams. Pink Himalayan sea salt, 1,000 milligrams, Alpha-GPC, 50%, 800 milligrams, Caffeine Anhydrous, 400 milligrams, Huperzine A, 200 micrograms. So that's the new supplement facts panel, but to actually showcase what has changed from one to the other and owning in on the dosages that have changed of ingredients that have stayed as the same ingredients, haven't been removed or anything, ingredients that have been added, like how does this supplement facts and this formula differ from this one line by line. So getting into the dosage changes of existing ingredients that are also in this but have changed their dosages. Caffeine went from 350 milligrams in 1 to 400 milligrams in 2.0. Citrulline went from 9,000 milligrams to 10,000 milligrams. Tyrosine went from 1,500 milligrams to 5,000 milligrams. Betaine anhydrous trimethylglycine went from 2,500 milligrams to 4,000 milligrams. Glycerol hydroprime went from 3,000 milligrams to 4,000 milligrams. And Huperzine A went from 400 micrograms to 200 micrograms. And the reason it went down is because of compliance, as well as in retail, specific dosage thresholds. In addition, being mindful of the cholinergic overlap from new precursors that we've added in, because like we added Alpha-GPC, for example, at a high dose in this formula that wasn't in this one. So there is absolutely precursor input that didn't exist here that stacked on top of the acetylcholinesterase inhibition component. You could be pushing somebody into overdoing it in a cholinergic context. So that's something to be mindful of. We'll dissect more later. Additions, what has been added to this formula that didn't exist in it before of new ingredients. So specific B vitamins in their biologically active formats to support specific neurotransmitter conversion pathways, most notably the dopaminergic pathway is of greatest concern in this formula for focus, drive, etc. Electrolytes, sodium, chloride, potassium, magnesium bisglycinate, these were all added. Hydroprime, this is sort of not really an addition, but more like a swap. So we had Glycer Pump before in this formula. We swapped to Hydroprime in the new mode, as well as increase the dose, because from what we've seen to date, Hydroprime seems to have superior stability and is more resilient to environmental changes. So if you guys know, glycerol, highly susceptible to clumping among, just being problematic to have in pre-workouts, where it used to not even be a viable ingredient in a powder format. And then they had these like stable versions come out that are patented by certain companies that manufacture them. We had Glycer Pump before and it was solid, and then Hydroprime is even better now. So that's what we swapped to. Alpha-GPC was added, 800 milligrams. Pink Himalayan sea salt was also added, 1,000 milligrams. Now what has been removed specifically? Kanna removal, N-phenyl dimethylamine citrate, bioperine, black pepper fruit extract, and agmatine sulfate. So I feel it worthwhile before we get into the actual formula breakdown to go over the removals, describe justification for why, and give transparent insight into thought process behind each. So first off, Kanna, solid ingredient for sense of well-being. I like it personally. That said, those effects are primarily driven through Kanna's serotonergic effects. So after years of experience with the ingredients, experimenting out the wazoo, and having tons of reviews, we now feel like it performs best out of the gym as a nootropic formula adjunct, not in the gym when you're trying to push adrenergic signaling, because ultimately the point is to drive, even if it's a mood elevating component of the formula, we need more drive and motivation, not like a smooth, just like calm sense of well-being. Because not necessarily the effect we were trying to enhance in the gym, and it can be kind of counterintuitive. So some people really like it though, and I'm not to discount that, but the net effect overall for the majority of people we find is counterproductive for most, as it can lead to a blunting of aggression that you actually use the pre-workout to get in the first place. So, and arguably equally important, the Kanna made this formula very difficult to flavor. So, and if you remember like the old Gorilla Mode Energy that had twice the amount of Kanna, it was like, tasted like you were drinking like fucking grass or something. Like it was really rough. So to make this like a much better tasting formula, and in my opinion, actually enhance the dopaminergic drive and adrenergic signaling that makes your adrenaline really push you in the gym, the removal was like not only kind of necessary to make this thing taste as good as it could, but also the net outcome was actually an improvement on the energy component of the formula, in my opinion. So overall, we think the formula, the removal of it from the formula makes the product hit harder for most people and unquestionably tastes better. So that one was kind of a no-brainer. Kana, great ingredient. I just think it should not be in a pre-workout anymore. N-phenylethyl dimethylamine citrate. I was concerned about letting this one go. It's seen as, you know, this exotic stimulant. But as the years went by, you know, I became less and less concerned. Because personally, I don't actually notice a big difference whatsoever, or even a minor difference when it's in versus out. You know, it was hyped up for years as this like DMHA alternative at the time when it came out, but it's far more subtle in my opinion. You know, some people like it a lot, but the removal of it frees up our formula for far more flexible retail compliance, first of all. And with the other increases and additions to the formula via dopaminergic, cholinergic, adrenergic pathways, the formula hits much harder than 1.0 ever did, even with its removal. So this is not just accomplished from the caffeine bump from 350 to 400 either. Like it's only 25 milligrams more per scoop ultimately. But it's the elements we took from our energy drinks actually, and Respawn, which is our most stacked nootropic formula for cognitive enhancement, and incorporated the ideas that went into those products and putting it into this formula in a capacity that was complementary to the pump performance component, and created what I feel is pretty clear nootropic synergy that exceeds the capacity of what Mode 1.0 ever achieved. So for those who really love N-phenylethyl dimethylamine citrate, you know, you can still buy it on its own as a singular ingredient from certain companies, but what I will say too, before we close out, is watch out for when our high stim pre-workout restocks with its own unique upgrades, because we have a little something planned. So something for you guys. But ultimately, I'm telling you, like there's actually, in my opinion, no net negative to its removal. And like the L-Tyrosine bump, the caffeine, the Alpha-GPC, all of it is a net bump in energy, drive, focus, above and beyond what you ever got from this. Bioperine, interesting one, black pepper fruit extract. So this was something many of us were led to believe simply enhances bioavailability, potency, and utility of essentially any ingredient. You know, the same can be said about ingredients like estrogen. You know, there are some ingredients that it makes sense to justify pairing with bioperine if you want to enhance bioavailability, like curcumin, for example. Clear data showing why that would be useful. However, I didn't feel the upside of putting it in our pre-workout made sense anymore. So black pepper alkaloids, well, first of all, they don't help the flavor whatsoever, again, and introducing a gut irritant to your system pre-workout to try and eke out additional speculated bioavailability just made a lot less sense as the years went on and I became more educated. So if you want to get a stronger effect out of ingredients that are absorbed just fine by the body, like what is the best way to go about doing that? In my opinion, it's probably just increasing the dose to know exactly what I'm getting, because at least we know the expected outcome, the pharmacokinetic profile of a lot of these well-established ingredients in human literature. But with bioperine, it doesn't actually enhance the bioavailability of almost all the shit that people put it in for. People will just throw it in and say, this enhances the bioavailability of the formula, but then not specify why. Like which ingredients does it augment and why? And what was so poorly bioavailable that it actually justified introducing a gut irritant into your formula? Because for us, you know, with the new updated formula, like there's nothing in here that is going to be enhanced to some significant capacity by adding bioperine that I could see personally. So didn't make sense anymore, net negative in a lot of aspects, gut health, taste profile, and just like, what is it helping with exactly? You know, I couldn't see the upside anymore. So it's out. Agmatine, last removal. I like agmatine personally. However, our formula already increased in ingredient amounts from around 30 to 40 grams per 2 scoops as mentioned, and we literally could not fit this in the formula without the tub needing to jump to a protein powder sized tub. So I was kind of forced to remove it, not necessarily out of choice. So agmatine has some vasodilation and pain tolerance effects that I think are worth consideration, but ultimately, you know, I have to be very selective about what we allocate our space to, and at least for what this pre-workout is meant to accomplish, which is be the all-around stacked pre-workout that you can not only rely on for performance, but also to get mentally dialed, energized. You know, we got higher utility out of the other ingredients we added in. You know, tyrosine is really fluffy and takes up a lot of room, unfortunately, but you know, putting in more of that to enhance the dopaminergic precursor component, maxing out the L-Citrulline, increasing the betaine. Now, these are all things that made more sense for like the Swiss Army knife stack formula than agmatine, which is a more vasodilation adjacent kind of ingredient, which ultimately we left in nitric. So don't worry about that. It's still going to be in nitric for you guys who really want that ingredient. You can still get it in our flagship stim-free pre-workout if you want the best of both worlds. Many of you are probably going to opt to stack the two of these formulas anyways. So it's not gone entirely, it's just gone from this formula. But I think it was a net benefit for this formula and what it's supposed to do. Because ultimately, like, unless you're a total noob to pre-workouts or somebody who needs something that's a little bit more GI tolerable because you have a sensitive stomach to things like creatine and whatnot, which is not totally uncommon, this ultimately, anywhere from like 0.5 to 2 scoops, should basically cover the needs of almost anybody in a pre-workout context, regardless if you're, you know, need something super heavy hitting, you know, the 2 scoop dose, or you're somebody who's relatively new to pre-workouts or, you know, doesn't have a very high caffeine and stimulant tolerance. Like, you are essentially covered via this, and then the stackability of nitric if you want to enhance the vasodilation pump performance category of ingredients, but don't want to push the stims any harder. So we think we have you covered essentially from all angles now from these 3 products, hopefully. All right, let's get into flavors and mixability before we get into the formula breakdown, which will be, I don't know how long, but it's gonna be fucking long. Flavors and mixability. So along with the formulation updates, we invested a lot of time into dramatically improving the flavor catalog, mixability, grittiness. You know, at one point, I think we had over 16 flavors of mode on the website. As you can imagine, nailing every single one of these in the catalog took a while, but we finally did it for every single one that has been released to date. They have been a clear upgrade since 1.0 in my opinion. And that's even with the huge jump in active ingredients per scoop. Mode 2.0 tastes much better than 1.0, and it mixes better too, assuming you use the right amount of water. I don't want to, the chalkiness and whatnot should be expected if you're not diluting enough. So just keep in mind, like, the amount of powder is a lot. But it doesn't need to be, you know, it depends on what dose you're using and how much water you use. So I wasn't sure if it'd be possible to make this, you know, taste better seeing as we're adding more actives, but, you know, it turned out better than I expected. And I think some of the removals made it a lot easier as well, like the Kana, for example. And not only that, you know, we added the natural colors. So I think that's awesome. You don't have to drink swamp water anymore, regardless of, as many of us might say, like, oh, I don't care how good it looks, I just drink it for functionality. It's like, ultimately, I think we would all prefer it to look nice as opposed to, like, if we could choose, and it does. So thank fuck, right? Keep in mind, there is a much higher dose of overall ingredients. So, you know, the water thing, I must stress that again. So I did mention earlier, like, the amount of water I'd recommend, 8 to 14 ounces per scoop, I think is a pretty wide range and should cover most people, but mixed to your desired flavor intensity ultimately. So you're gonna have to experiment a little bit. So formula breakdown. Let's get into it. Essential vitamins, let's bang these out, as well as the electrolytes, and then we'll get into the real meat and potatoes shortly enough. Soon-ish. Essential vitamins support various physiologic functions, including maintaining a healthy immune system, energy metabolism, and nervous system function. They can't be synthesized in the body in adequate amounts, so you must get them from diet or supplementation. And in general, most diets are deficient in one or more essential vitamins, and the synthesis of several hormones and neurotransmitters are reliant on satisfactory quantities of all of these. So, for example, having enough B vitamins present is critical for dopamine synthesis. You know, I've criticized companies in the past for using trace vitamins and antioxidants in their formula, and this is still something I see as commonplace to this day. You know, companies including a pixie dusting of them to make their label look long and more impressive, to overshadow and mask how embarrassing the rest of the formula is. G Fuel, fucking G Fuel. We didn't include antioxidants because we are not trying to suppress inflammation during the workout. We actually want the acute hormetic stress, and literature suggests it's counterproductive for muscle growth to use antioxidants pre-workout. But we did include a few methylated B vitamins to support dopaminergic signaling in the biosynthesis cascade chart that I just showed. Felt it worthwhile as kind of an insurance policy of sorts. Has no bearing on presenting the formula as more comprehensive than it actually is. Hopefully you can see that by my, breaking down of why it's there and what would even support its inclusion. So first, niacin, 32 milligrams is niacinamide. So also known as vitamin B3, plays a key role in energy production, the maintenance of healthy skin, nervous system function, and DNA synthesis. Niacin supplementation has been associated with improved sensory register, which is the short-term storage of memory received through the environment, and short-term memory. How the literature available suggests this is facilitated through enhanced neuronal transmission. Next up, P5P, vitamin B6, methylated B6, as pyridoxal 5-phosphate, 20 milligrams. So much like other B vitamins, B6 plays several overlapping roles in supporting optimal function. But with that said, the main attribute of interest in this formula is the impact it has on the production of neurotransmitters such as serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline. L-Dopa, levodopa, is the precursor to dopamine, meaning that it is converted into dopamine in the brain. And this conversion process is facilitated by an enzyme called aromatic amino acid decarboxylase, L-Dopa decarboxylase, which requires P5P, methylated B6, as a cofactor. So I chose to include activated B6, P5P, instead of the commonly used pyridoxine HCl because the conversion process directly requires P5P. In addition, literature shows that supplementing with inactive B6, pyridoxine, may competitively inhibit activated B6 from working and could even paradoxically lead to a B6 deficiency through the supplementation of pyridoxine, HCl. So adequate B6 status is critical for downstream dopaminergic neurotransmission and is why we included the P5P. B12 as methylcobalamin, 250 micrograms. B12 is required for the development, myelination, and function of the central nervous system. Contextually in this formula, B12 acts as a cofactor in the synthesis of neurotransmitters such as serotonin, dopamine, and deficiency in B12 can lead to decreased production of neurotransmitters, affect cognitive function, and cause symptoms such as fatigue and lethargy. Cyanocobalamin and methylcobalamin are probably the most common two forms of B12. Methylcobalamin is the biologically active form, and cyanocobalamin is the most common form found in supplements and fortified foods. I included methylcobalamin specifically because it is a better methyl donor compared to cyanocobalamin, and some studies have suggested that methylcobalamin supplementation may have a positive impact on neurotransmitter function. And ultimately, just having activated B vitamins, I feel like, is probably a better move. Overall, for the majority of individuals, just to cover bases just in case. Some individuals have problems when they start supplementing high doses of inactive precursors. Moving on to the minerals and electrolytes, 1,430 milligrams in total. And of this 1,430, it's comprised of the following: pink Himalayan sea salt at 1,000 milligrams. And within the pink Himalayan sea salt, the yield is 380 milligrams of sodium, as well as 600 milligrams of chloride. And then on top, we have potassium as potassium chloride, 380 milligrams, and magnesium as magnesium bisglycinate at 50 milligrams. So electrolytes, I'm gonna do a little high level in electrolytes here. They're charged particles that have a crucial role in maintaining various physiologic functions in the body. Primarily dissolved in bodily fluids such as blood, extracellular fluid, and intracellular fluid, and they're needed for nerve signaling, muscle contraction, fluid balance. This includes sustaining intracellular hydration, pH regulation, blood pressure regulation, among several other critical processes. And a lot of you guys are probably familiar, but just for the sake of breaking it down to really highlight how important this is, the negative effects of dehydration on performance. Some people do go into workouts dehydrated and just don't think about it. They'll have their pre-workout, they'll make sure they're well fed, but then actually don't really think about the hydration status and how it affects their performance. So maybe worth hammering on. Some of the consequences of dehydration include decreased strength. Electrolytes are critical for proper muscle contraction, nerve function. When electrolyte levels are disrupted, muscle contractions become much less efficient. And there are other factors that play into this as well, like muscle glycogen loss, but overall, Takeaway is it will hinder strength. Impaired thermoregulation. So dehydration can reduce the body's ability to sweat, which impairs the body's ability to regulate temperature. This can lead to overheating, heat exhaustion, even heat stroke. Increased heart rate. Dehydration can cause heart rate to increase in order to maintain blood circulation. This can result in higher perceived effort during exercise and contribute to fatigue very significantly. Muscle cramps. Dehydration can lead to imbalances in electrolytes such as sodium, potassium, magnesium, and those play a critical role in maintaining muscle function. And having an imbalance or deficiency can lead to pretty significant cramps and spasms that, as you would expect, are pretty debilitating mid-game or mid-lift, like whatever it is. It's not good to have mid something important that's sports performance related. Fatigue and weakness. Dehydration can lead to feelings of fatigue and weakness due to reduced blood volume and inadequate delivery of oxygen to muscles and organs. Also, decreased cognitive function. Dehydration can impair cognitive functions such as concentration, decision-making, and reaction time. And this might not even be noticeable. This is something that if you're minorly dehydrated, you might have no clue that it's actually impacting even the way you go about your gameplay in the middle of a sport or decisions you're making on a day-to-day basis, making bad business decisions. Like it affects a lot of things that a lot of people would not consider. And from an athletic capacity standpoint, it impacts the athlete's ability to make strategic decisions during a game or competition to a detrimental level. Increased risk of injuries. This one's super important and notable. Dehydrated muscles are more prone to injuries such as strains, sprains, tears. It also affects joint lubrication. So if you're dehydrated, you have a higher risk of joint injuries as well. And then ultimately, delayed recovery. Poor hydration will impact post-exercise recovery negatively. Dehydration can delay the ability to repair muscle, replenish glycogen stores, and remove metabolic waste products. So the effects of electrolyte supplementation on pump performance and muscular creatine uptake are what I want to get into next, which is basically the underpinnings of why we included what we did for something that is not meant to be a electrolyte formula. Rather, it's supposed to cover your bases for common baseline mineral deficiencies, which are potassium and magnesium, and to attenuate the performance decrement that can accompany losing the amount of sweat that occurs during a typical weight training session. And that's, primarily driven through sodium chloride loss. So the difference in pump and overall performance between training hydrated versus not is pretty night and day. I'm sure a lot of you guys can attest to that. In addition, this is something that I learned, creatine uptake is increased when concentrations of sodium and chloride are increased, even when creatine concentrations remain constant. Several studies have shown that supplementing creatine with electrolytes aids with increased uptake and storage of muscular creatine, thus potentially augmenting performance. And fortunately, for the purpose of what most use a pre-workout for, we don't need nearly as much electrolyte coverage as we would for long, grueling endurance activities. So we were able to include what I think is essentially a minimum effective dose without making the formula taste too salty. So if you use enough water, you shouldn't notice the salt to a degree that makes this taste bad whatsoever. Whereas with, highly potent electrolyte formulas like our hydration formula, like you are expecting to go into that to drink something that is flavored nicely, but will ultimately taste like extremely salty. That is not the case with Gorilla Mode. You might detect some level of saltiness, but ultimately it's not an amount that pushes it over the threshold that would hinder the flavor quality in any significant amount, in my opinion. And I think it actually brings out the flavors more, having the sodium in there, which is cool. So I included specifically chelated magnesium bisglycinate in particular, because it's very bioavailable. One of my, if not my favorite form of magnesium, depending on the situation, of course, but this is the least likely to cause digestive distress, or one of the least likely with high bioavailability, whereas cheaper forms of magnesium are more likely to cause GI issues mid-exercise and may even be counterproductive to hydration status. So not only will opting for bisglycinate chelate format lower the probability of having to take like an emergency dump mid-lift, but it should also enhance the hydrating capacity of the overall formula, as it doesn't pull hydration out of the extracellular fluid into the intestine as much as other forms of magnesium. And for heavily demanding endurance activity, or if you simply need more electrolytes to fuel your even short bouts of training, depending on temperature, if you're a heavy sweater, depending on how salty your sweat is, that's where I would recommend actually looking to a dedicated hydration formula that pushes the sodium, potassium, and magnesium harder to account for extra fluid and electrolyte loss, and also includes the other electrolytes that are worth paying closer attention to when you're sweating multiple liters out. So, in our formula, the hydration formula, we included as well, on top of the main electrolytes, all of the other more trace ones that are not going to be in significant quantities for just like a typical workout, but in endurance context actually become worthwhile to be paying attention to, in addition to trace elements that cover sweat-induced deficiencies that I have not yet seen another hydration formula pay attention to, like iodine status, for example, which it's actually shockingly common to, or a lot more common than I thought it was, to induce deficiency via like heavy sweating and not adequate replenishment. So just be prepared for this kind of a formula. Hydration to taste salty, but Gorilla Mode does not, and basically covers your bases for like, a 1 to 2 hour lift. If you go in adequately hydrated, like your pre-workout should cover your basis for like the minor amount of sweating that you probably have. And then if you are a heavy sweater, high temperature, etc., look to an actual hydration formula. So anyways, getting into the actives now that are not comprised of, just essential vitamins, electrolytes, getting into the actual active ingredients that make up the meat and potatoes of the formula. Pure L-Citrulline, not citrulline malate, 10,000 milligrams. So citrulline is arguably the most effective supplement you can use to boost nitric oxide in the body. It works indirectly via raising the levels of arginine in the body, which serves as a precursor for the formation of nitric oxide, NO for short. Paradoxically, L-Citrulline actually outperforms arginine supplements for increasing arginine levels and subsequently NO levels, which we'll get to shortly as to why that's the case. Gorilla Mode 1.0 had 9,000 milligrams of L-Citrulline per max dose, and our stim-free nitric formula always had 10,000 milligrams even on launch in 2019. So as a component of the Gorilla Mode upgrades, we increased the dose from 9,000 in 1.0 to 10,000 in 2.0 to match the nitric 10,000 dose. Like when we formulated nitric, we wanted to set it apart with unique over-the-top vasodilation and hyperhydration that hadn't yet been achieved in the industry to date, at least that I was aware of. And that's how we created this formula back when we did. I think it might have launched 2020. I think it was shortly, I think it was like 5 or 6 months after Mode 1.0, which was October 2019, I believe. But the unique ingredients that we included in nitric already accomplished that through nitrates, vasodrive AP, agmatine, etc. And it segregated the two formulas in pump induction potential. And then we also had a 1,000 milligram disparity in citrulline between the formulas. So for almost half a decade now, we've had basically Mode having 1,000 milligrams less citrulline than nitric, but rather than decreasing the nitric dose to 9,000 to match Mode, we just decided it would make a lot more sense to, integrate the max efficacious dose of citrulline into Mode 2.0 as well. So now both formulas have 10 grams per max dose. Notably though, nitric, as mentioned, hits other vectors that make it unique from a pump and performance standpoint, as opposed to like most stim-free pre-workouts that companies have. It's just like the same as their stim-based pre-workout minus the stim. It's just like, here it is without caffeine, which is not very exciting and doesn't really leave much utility to it above and beyond the main one. So if you're capped for space and then you have all this space freed up from all these energy boosting and nootropic ingredients that you take out, you have some room to play with when it comes to unique vectors to lean harder into or other complementary adjuncts to actually add in, which is the cool thing about nitric, is that we're actually able to hammer those to the max capacity we can when it comes to vasodilation, hyperhydration, pump, etc. So like nitric and Mode each have their own unique attributes that can be combined for a synergistic effect, or They work incredibly well on their own as well. They just skew a little bit more aggressively in favor of their tailored application. So nitric, like what is it tailored for? It is for maximum pump and overall performance, but no stimulants, no nootropics. The only cognitive enhancing component that you would get out of this is like some cerebral vasodilation potential. Like there is a cognitive lift that you get from having like highly augmented vasodilation and being more hydrated and whatnot, of course, but there's nothing that is directly like driving like adrenaline or anything like that. Whereas mode, it's more important to hit every vector as hard as possible within the scope of what can fit in the tub. So mode is the most well-rounded for overall, it's the most overall well-rounded potent pre-workout for every category you could touch essentially. So that's, pump, performance, cognitive lift, force production, etc. Like this is the Swiss Army knife stacked formula. So if you're looking for like the best of all worlds, that's where you would look to mode. And then if you're somebody who is highly sensitive to stims, or you want to push the vasodilation, hyperhydration component a little bit harder, that's where you look to be stacking or doing like, 1 and 1 when it comes to one scoop. That's what a lot of people do, but we'll get into that later in terms of optimally combining them. Why is NO, nitric oxide, important? NO is made naturally in our bodies and plays a significant role in cardiovascular health, dilates blood vessels through something called vasodilation, which lowers blood pressure and increases the oxygen in the blood. Nitric oxide acts as a messenger to signal blood vessels to dilate or contract and relax, and sufficient nitric oxide is needed to signal blood vessels to contract or relax to ensure blood can flow to and from the heart effectively. Nitric oxide production decreases with age and consequently reduces the elasticity of the cardiovascular system and can impair the body's ability to ensure enough oxygenated blood is actually reaching vital organs. And in addition, maintaining optimal NO levels will visibly make you more vascular and give you better pump, increase muscular volume, enhance the delivery of oxygen and nutrients to working muscles, support recovery, and just improve overall physical performance. Maximum effective dose of L-Citrulline. Citrulline is found in watermelons, and you would need to eat 1.5 kilograms of watermelon every day to get 3 grams of citrulline, which is the minimum effective dose. To get the max effective dose from your diet, you would need to eat 5 kilograms of watermelon per day. Yeah, 5 kilograms of watermelon to get 10,000 milligrams of L-Citrulline. So obviously nobody, somebody in the comments is gonna be like, I would eat that shit. Obviously nobody is going to eat that much watermelon, I would think. So, somewhat analogous to creatine, where it's, the primary source of it in food does not really have a high enough concentration for it to be possible for most people to hit the max effective dose daily via their diet. Citrulline is probably an even more extreme example of that, because at least creatine, it's like, there's a lot of people that eat carnivore diets now or super meat dense diets that might actually be hitting their creatine needs through diet relatively easily. But, when it comes to watermelons, it's like, this is why L-citrulline supplementation could be worthwhile if you're trying to max out this vector. Let's get into the effects. So the effects of L-citrulline supplementation on muscular endurance, rating of perceived exertion, RPE, and relief of muscle soreness. So there's an array of studies that showcase exactly what kind of effect L-citrulline supplementation has on these specific metrics. First study, a randomized double-blind 2-period crossover design study compared the effects of citrulline malate to placebo on flat bench performance and post-exercise muscle soreness. The participants had to perform as many reps as possible until fatigue for multiple sets. A single 8,000 milligram dose of citrulline malate increased the number of reps performed per set on every set after set 2. Citrulline became more impactful and performance increased the more sets were performed, achieving 52.92% more repetitions and the 100% of response in the last set. A significant decrease of 40% in muscle soreness at 24 hours and 48 hours after the chest training session, and a higher percentage response than 90% was achieved with citrulline malate supplementation. Another study, in a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled crossover trial, 15 resistance-trained participants took 8,000 milligrams of citrulline malate or placebo 1 hour before bench and leg press exercises. There was an increase in both upper and lower body resistance exercise performance and decreased RPE during upper body exercise. Another randomized double-blind placebo-controlled crossover trial had 14 resistance-trained participants take 8,000 milligrams of citrulline malate or placebo prior to 3 sets each of chin-ups, reverse chin-ups, and push-ups to failure. A week later, they performed the same exercise test, but with the other supplement. If they had placebo last time, they'd get citrulline malate this time, and vice versa. And their blood lactate, cardiovascular dynamics, and resistance exercise performance was assessed. Citrulline malate ingestion significantly increased the amount of repetitions performed for each exercise. Chin-ups, reverse chin-ups, push-ups. In another randomized, counterbalanced, double-blind study, subjects were randomly assigned to placebo or citrulline malate, 8 grams. Either they were put in the placebo or citrulline group, and then performed repeated bouts of multiple lower body resistance exercise. Specifically, subjects performed 5 sequential sets, 60% of their 1 rep max, to failure on the leg press, hack squat, and leg extension machines. Subjects in the citrulline malate 8-gram group performed significantly higher number of repetitions during all 3 exercises compared with the placebo group. These data indicate that athletes competing in sports with muscular endurance-based requirements may potentially improve performance by acutely supplementing citrulline malate. Moving on to the effects of L-citrulline supplementation on explosive power and grip strength. 17 female masters athlete tennis players completed 2 double-blind randomized trials consuming either citrulline malate, and in this they had 12 grams of dextrose plus 8 grams citrulline malate, and then also another group, placebo, which was just the 12 grams of dextrose, no citrulline malate. 1 hour after consumption, subjects completed grip strength, vertical power, and wing gait anaerobic cycling assessments in respective order. Maximal hand grip strength and average grip strength, and explosive power and relative peak power on the wing gait cycling test were all higher in those using citrulline. The effects of citrulline supplementation on vasodilation, power output, and time to exhaustion. In a randomized placebo-controlled crossover study, 10 healthy adult men completed moderate and severe intensity cycling exercise on days 6 and 7 of a 7-day supplementation period with placebo, arginine 6 grams per day, and citrulline 6 grams per day. Citrulline, but not arginine, supplementation improved blood pressure, VO2 kinetics, and exercise performance. And we'll get into why citrulline works better than arginine now, because it sounds paradoxical. So citrulline versus arginine. One of the most recognized pump ingredients is arginine. The problem, though, with L-arginine is it is not efficient at increasing NO synthesis. You would assume, logically, taking arginine would be the most effective way to increase arginine levels in the body, but that is not the case, actually. Oral L-arginine is taken up and metabolized by the liver to a large extent, not only making it an inefficient way to increase NO levels, but literature suggests it may even be unsafe to do so and use because of how much urea it yields in the process. L-citrulline, on the other hand, is not captured by the liver and passes freely to the kidneys where it is metabolized to arginine. The most effective supplement that can be used to increase arginine levels in the body, backfill nitric oxide, and significantly improve pumps is pretty difficult to argue with being L-citrulline. Like, it is the top of the top when it comes to NO precursors. So the effects of L-citrulline supplementation on cardiometabolic health. Supplementation with L-citrulline has shown promise as a blood pressure lowering intervention, both resting and stress-induced in adults with hypertension, high blood pressure. Preliminary evidence is also available for L-citrulline-induced benefits to muscle and metabolic health via vascular and non-vascular pathways. As shown in the systemic effects breakdown, there are several positive attributes of L-citrulline: arginine bioavailability, NO synthesis and bioavailability, vasodilation improvement, muscle perfusion, lipolysis, mitochondrial biogenesis, perhaps even protein synthesis, decreasing the risk of hypertension, atherosclerosis, inflammation, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease. Keep in mind, I am just quoting this study here, and they're pretty blatant and significant claims. So it's a very promising ingredient, not just for, getting sick, veiny pumps, but also for the cardiovascular support component potentially, and is strongly suggested by a lot of this data. So what is the problem with citrulline malate? I mentioned it earlier. A lot of you guys might already know the answer to this because I did detail it in my gorilla mode video back in 2019, and it is still an issue today, all but much more known about now, which is cool, by the way, that people know so widely at this point, like what this process is. But citrulline's a great supplement, but there's a red flag around it that you need to know about if you don't. So I'm sure you've seen a lot of supplements that have citrulline in them, and some have citrulline malate. The labels might even say citrulline malate on the label. This isn't always, but it is often a cheap trick companies use to deceive customers. So citrulline malate is composed of 50% malic acid, unless the ratio states otherwise, and the rest is citrulline. So authentic citrulline malate is produced by chemically bonding free-form L-Citrulline to malic acid. When citrulline is chemically bonded to malic acid, the end result is this composition, citrulline malate. But the problem with it is there is no chemical reaction that occurs during the creation of these pre-workouts. It's just citrulline mixed in a vat with malic acid in the manufacturing facility. So there's no chemical bond like there should be to create authentic citrulline malate. It's just the two ingredients being mixed in a blend, being sold as a composition citrulline malate or L-citrulline malate. But the reality is it's just citrulline stirred up with malic acid. So this isn't a huge deal in itself, but the problem lies in the labeling practices companies use to artificially inflate the perceived potency of the product. So 6 to 8 grams is touted to be the maximum clinically proven efficacious dosage in the supplement industry in general. Or at least, that's what it was years ago, and I guess a lot of companies still tell you that in their marketing to this day. So first of all, we know at this point, and I've known for years now, if you've been in this, following the channel or seen the first gorilla mode video, the actual max efficacious dose is 10 grams per day of pure L-citrulline. In addition, and not citrulline malate, pure L-citrulline. In addition, the main issue is that citrulline is in the product can be as low as half of the label claim via the malic acid inflation. So as mentioned, citrulline malate is just a mixture of citrulline and malic acid. And to this day, even half a decade later, after I made my video about this, many companies are still labeling their products with this chemically bonded citrulline malate and then using that to claim they have X grams of citrulline per serving in their pre-workout in their marketing, when they actually just have half of that, or 2/3 at most. Example, 6 grams of citrulline malate could be as low as 3 grams of actual citrulline and 3 grams of malic acid per serving. So instead of labeling a product like L-citrulline 3,000 milligrams, malic acid 3,000 milligrams, a lot of companies will label their products like citrulline malate 6,000 milligrams or L-citrulline malate 6,000 milligrams or 6 grams, making you think you're getting a really high dose, but in reality you're getting the bare minimum efficacious dose per serving of 3 grams. Sometimes companies will tweak the ratio a bit, or their manufacturers just have this in their inventory to be a bit more in favor of the higher citrulline content relative to malic acid, but rarely this is any higher than 2 to 1. So it's pretty common to see citrulline malate 2 to 1, 2:1 in brackets, 6,000 milligrams or 6 grams. That just means the company has 4 grams of pure L-citrulline and 2 grams of malic acid per serving. And this is to illustrate this, I feel it's worth showing. I've showed this on the channel before. This is the exact manufacturing process involved in producing the L-citrulline and citrulline malate you get in pre-workouts in the supplement industry. So as you can see, the citrulline malate manufacturing flowchart on the right literally just says mix. We have chemically synthesized DL malate. After you have the L-citrulline yielded down here, you just mix it to end up with L-citrulline DL malate 2 to 1. So as you can see, if this was authentic citrulline malate, you wouldn't need to mix L-citrulline with malic acid. It would be chemically bonded together by the end of the manufacturing process. There would be no instruction to mix them together in a vat. You're not really getting what you're paying for, and most don't realize this is a tactic in the industry to get better margins often and artificially inflate a product's perceived efficacy. Even if a pre-workout had what on paper appears to be an a top end efficacious dose of 8 grams per serving, like how much citrulline are you actually getting out of that? Well, it depends. It could be 4 grams, it could be 6 grams at most. In addition, even if you had the bonded version, which supplements don't, reacted citrulline malate will break apart into citrulline and malic acid anyways. So, you know, bonded citrulline malate doesn't do anything special that citrulline and malic acid supplemented together won't already do. It's more the way it's presented, because the marketing material might say this many grams of citrulline or imply it strongly, you know, and just like leaving out the very, very important underlying issue of like, no. It is actually 6 grams of citrulline plus malic acid, which is actually 4 grams of citrulline, or 3 grams, which is what it should be saying, rather than being like, yeah, we have 6 grams of citrulline in the product. It's like, no, like, look at the label. So depending on the company's verbiage, this is often just a marketing angle to artificially inflate a product's perceived L-citrulline concentration on a label, as each ingredient would ideally, in my opinion, be listed separately for maximum transparency on real L-citrulline yields. So that gets into malic acid as the next ingredient. So it's not literally the next one on the list of the supplement facts, but I felt it was worthwhile to put in this video here, so then we're not jumping backwards, because malic acid doesn't actually come up on the supplement facts until we get through another 1, 2, 3, 4 ingredients. So we're not going to wait until we get past hydroprime to get back to malic acid, and we're literally talking about it, so let's talk about it. So malic acid, 3,000 milligrams. That's what we have in every 2 scoops of Gorilla Mode, and that's on top of the 10,000 milligrams of L-citrulline. So it's 10,000 L-citrulline, 3,000 malic acid. So L-citrulline and malic acid work via a different mechanism of action. Citrulline bypasses the liver, gets converted into arginine, which increases nitric oxide in the body, whereas malic acid is a Krebs cycle intermediary that may enhance ATP production. There's no literature I'm aware of that assesses malic acid versus L-citrulline versus citrulline malate. So it's kind of impossible to say for certain how much of the performance enhancement that we see in the literature comes from each ingredient. Because again, it is, you know, they're using citrulline malate in these performance studies, notably. So there is research on citrulline and citrulline malate, so we can extrapolate to try and discern how much of the benefit comes from citrulline, but we can't be sure. So considerate of this, rather than just putting in citrulline at the topped out dose and then leaving no malic acid, we included malic acid as an insurance policy. So I included an additional 3,000 milligrams of it separately in the formula as an active ingredient in the ingredient panel as like a just in case. And this is something that we did as far back as 2019. I don't know if I ever saw this being done before that. Like typically the only other time you would see malic acid in the active section at all is like within the citrulline malate line item, inflating the perceived dosage essentially. So like I'm not aware of any companies that are including a maxed out 10 gram dose of L-citrulline, as well as a proportionally complementary amount of malic acid separately. You know, like some might have started doing it after Gorilla Mode in 2019 ramped up, but I'm assuming it's still rare if it's being done, but you know, it's worth understanding, and that's, you know, the context of why we did it back in 2019 and why we're still doing it in 2024. So if there is some sort of performance enhancing benefit you get from a high dose of malic acid, you're getting it on top of the max efficacious dose of 10,000 milligrams of pure L-citrulline. Like at the end of the day, for vasodilation though, because again, a lot of people are using citrulline for the pump component, you should concern yourself with how much pure L-citrulline is in your pre-workout, ultimately. By the way, what's wild is back in 2019, I literally could not find a product with more than 6,000 milligrams of pure L-citrulline. And, you know, I'd only seen a handful of products that had 6 grams of citrulline, another handful that had like 8 grams citrulline malate, which yields like 4 to 5 grams of actual citrulline. The remainder is malic acid. And back then, it was extremely unique to have a product that had more than 6 grams of pure L-citrulline, let alone 9 to 10 grams. Since then, though, I've seen a lot of companies come out with their stacked version of a pre-workout, you know, pushing the envelope with citrulline dosages, pushing the max efficacious dosages of various vectors. Like, I truly think we made a difference on impacting the direction of standards in the industry, which is pretty fucking cool. You know, just thinking back in, you know, the last 5 years and how things have developed, it's really cool to see the transparency elevation as well as like the dosage expectations. Like, you know, it's wildly different than, you know, back when I first started buying pre-workouts when I was in high school. God, the prop blends and like the weak underdose shit. It was just like some pitiful spit in your face amount of citrulline, fucking all these ingredients that are actually useful for pump and performance, just like nuts on your face dosages, and then like a heavy hit of caffeine, and you're good, bro. You know, the scoops were these little tiny things because they just didn't need to fit much in them. So I think we've come a long way in this industry, and it's cool to see. So anyways, back to the Gorilla Mode. So, you know, I put 10 grams of pure L-Citrulline Gorilla Mode as well as Malic Acid, 3 grams separately to get the full benefits of each ingredient. Hopefully, you know, if there's some synergy that we haven't yet elucidated in a segregated way in the literature, like you're hopefully getting it. If we wanted to, we could have technically labeled this as 13 grams of citrulline malate on our label. But this way, with it written the way it is, you can see exactly what you're getting separately. And it's not confusing. It's not, you know, a marketing tactic. You know, even if you decide to use 1 scoop of this product, you're still getting 5 grams of pure L-Citrulline, and the formula's still top notch. So that is the L-Citrulline breakdown. Moving on to creatine monohydrate. This one has developed a lot over the years, and there's a lot more to get into. Creatine is arguably the best studied and most effective performance enhancing supplement that exists. Supplementing with creatine is shown time and time again to significantly improve strength, power output, muscle size, and an array of other functions that we'll get into shortly. So the first of many though, the effects of creatine supplementation on strength. Short-term creatine supplementation has been reported to improve maximal power/strength by 5 to 15%. Work performed during sets of maximal effort muscle contractions, 5 to 15%. Single effort sprint performance by 1 to 5%. And work performed during repetitive sprint performance, 5 to 15%. Moreover, creatine supplementation during training has been reported to promote significantly greater gains in strength, fat-free mass, and performance, most reliably during high-intensity exercise. Creatine's effect on strength is facilitated by increasing the body's stores of phosphocreatine, which is then used during high-intensity exercise to produce ATP. Now, getting into the size, how does it increase size? What are the effects? The impact on performance is very clear. Creatine appears to also have inherent lean mass building properties that account for its impact on muscle size, though, but a large amount of research is confounded with water weight gains, which I do want to dissect a little bit. So for example, it's going to get pretty extreme. One subject in the following study reported having a fairly consistent body mass throughout the previous year, and he experienced a 10.58 pound, 4.8 kilogram increase in body mass during the first week of creatine supplementation, 90% of which was accounted for by the increase in total body water. So a lot of people, when they think of creatine, they think, oh, it's bloating, bad, not good. You know, I don't want that. People who know how a muscle functions though, and what contributes to muscular volume, size, strength, anti-injury, understand that this isn't necessarily a bad thing. So creatine's acute effects on muscle size are facilitated by drawing water into the muscle via osmosis, consequently increasing body weight and muscle size. But in addition to that, with the increased strength that creatine provides, heavier weights can be used in the gym, which provide more stimulus for growth, and consequently increases muscle accrual in the long term. For some reason, water retention is perceived to be bad by some when it comes to creatine, but the reality is it's typically helpful and in the muscle. So remember, water is the main component of the body and represents approximately 76% of muscle mass. So there's a reason why you can lift more and look more jacked when your glycogen stores are topped out. For every gram of glycogen stored in human muscle, there is a complementary approximate 3 to 4 gram amount of intramuscular water, significantly contributing to fullness and performance. And that leads to another mechanism by which creatine facilitates its effects on muscle size, which is its effect on glycogen storage capacity. So getting into the effects of creatine supplementation on carbohydrate-mediated muscle glycogen supercompensation. In a study with 14 recreationally active and non-vegetarian healthy men, aged 26 on average, with no history of prior creatine supplementation, Creatine and carbohydrate ingestion augmented post-exercise muscle glycogen storage compared to carbohydrate feeding alone. Creatine supplementation markedly augmented post-exercise muscle glycogen storage above placebo during a conventional carbohydrate loading regimen. The magnitude of glycogen resynthesis during the first 24 hours of supplementation was roughly 82% greater in the creatine group compared to placebo. Next up, we have the effects of creatine supplementation on satellite cells and myonuclei. So a lot of people know of the banking of myonuclei via exposure to anabolics. I feel like it's probably the most common context by which people explore this area of research, and how there could be a permanent accrual over time via enhanced anabolic stimulation, as well as the induction of satellite cell proliferation, but through things like growth hormone utilization. These are all areas that are seen as like performance enhancing vectors via drugs. What a lot of people don't know is that creatine supplementation may also augment the training-induced increase in the number of satellite cells and myonuclei in human skeletal muscle, which would increase the growth potential of those fibers. So there are numerous things that increase the density of satellite cells and actual banking up of myonuclei to increase your threshold of kind of like muscle memory set point. And anything that can help enhance that to a notable degree with no deleterious effects, also notable, is absolutely worth consideration. So like creatine having an effect on this potentially as well, like very, very notable in my opinion. The effects of creatine supplementation on myostatin levels. This is another very interesting one. Myostatin is a protein that is produced and released by myocytes and acts on muscle cells to inhibit muscle growth. Animals either lacking myostatin or treated with substances that block the activity of myostatin have significantly more muscle mass. I'm sure you've seen at this point countless images of Belgian blues, whippets, myostatin knockout mice, follistatin treated mice. There are a lot of examples at this point. Still incredibly impressive and shocking to this day. They are essentially the Mr. Olympias of their whatever animal they are. And it's wild that the genetic predisposition, regardless of diet, training, stimulus, etc., like these animals essentially are predisposed to being able to grow more via this supposed, limiter being a non-factor or a significantly inhibited and attenuated factor via drug-induced means. Literature has also shown that individuals who have mutations in both copies of the myostatin gene have significantly more muscle mass and are stronger than normal. Expectedly, pharmaceutical pipeline myostatin inhibitors are something that's being evaluated pretty thoroughly right now. There's numerous pharma companies that have myostatin inhibitors as a target with the goal of developing more efficacious treatments for an array of catabolic conditions. However, to date, these compounds have not achieved success, even among those seeking out gene therapy in adulthood. Like there are individuals that are going to great lengths to try and either enhance the endogenous production of follistatin or literally inject follistatin itself, or try and inhibit myostatin directly. I delve into this in greater detail in one of my podcasts with Peter Attia. Highly recommend you check it out to see kind of the stance on myostatin inhibition and current therapies around its targeting. To be clear, I don't think myostatin inhibition doesn't work. I just have yet to see any effective therapies play out in humans. And from what I've seen, the foundations being laid for like the benefits of this targeting would be seen in utero. So for example, the acceleration of muscle growth in Belgian blues is due primarily to physiological changes in the animal's muscle fibers from hypertrophy to a hyperplasia mode of growth. And this occurs in the fetus and results in a calf being born with 2 times the number of muscle fibers as a calf without a myostatin gene mutation. So as a preface, obviously creatine is not, I highly doubt the majority of creatine's effects, or even a small amount, are via this myostatin inhibiting property. It may have no effect whatsoever. However, I don't know if this finding is reproduced widely either, but I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't mention that creatine supplementation in conjunction with resistance training has shown to lead to greater decreases in serum myostatin than resistance training alone. So that's another cool attribute of creatine that a lot of people aren't aware of, is that it can actually inhibit myostatin as well, potentially, which in a fully grown adult, is that actually going to make a huge difference? I don't know for sure, but it is worth noting, especially because creatine is safe, well tolerated, highly effective, and you would probably be using it anyways. And now there's this other fringe upside potentially, and might have some contributing role to the effects you actually get on performance, muscle size, etc. down the line. A lot of people aren't aware that it had an impact on myostatin at all. Next up, the effects of creatine supplementation on cognitive function, another newly explored area that is very interesting. Recently, literature has emerged showing how impactful creatine is not just on sports performance and body composition, but also cognitive function. In a 2024 study, subjects were orally administered a single 20-gram dose of creatine monohydrate while performing cognitive tests during sleep deprivation. Creatine improved cognitive performance and processing speed, suggesting that a high single dose of creatine can partially reverse metabolic alterations and fatigue-related cognitive deterioration. Another study showed that supplementing 20 grams of creatine for 7 days improved cognitive function in the elderly. Do you need to supplement creatine, or can you get it through your diet? Very commonly asked question with a little bit of nuance. So expectedly, vegetarians have been reported to have lower intramuscular creatine stores, 90 to 110 millimole per kilogram of dry muscle, apparently is average, and therefore may observe greater gains in muscle creatine content from supplementing. However, I think the problem is also a lot of people that have a mixed diet assume if they aren't eating a vegan diet, adhering to their like a typical omnivorous diet will provide them with an optimal amount of creatine because they eat some meat, but that often isn't the case. The average person synthesizes approximately 1 gram of creatine per day endogenously. A typical omnivorous diet provides about 1 to 2 grams of creatine per day. Often, this isn't enough to maintain optimal topped-out creatine stores, especially for those with impaired methylation or creatine synthesis deficiencies due to inborn errors. So to maintain maxed out total creatine stores in muscle, which accounts for approximately 95% of total creatine stores, as well as in the brain and testes, which a lot of people don't realize is actually a factor, which accounts for about 5% of total creatine stores, most individuals would need to eat at least a pound of red meat a day, which is typically unrealistic for most to adhere to. In general, most who wish to optimize performance, hypertrophy, health, stand to benefit from creatine supplementation is the main takeaway. The effects of creatine supplementation on methylation and health status. So there are a host of processes in the body that rely on creatine to be carried out optimally and are often neglected, but one of the most notable functions of creatine is its support of neurological activity. So in addition, the endogenous synthesis of creatine relies on a process called methylation. Arginine and glycine are combined by an enzyme to form guanidinoacetate, which is then methylated into creatine. The problem is that this process is dependent on a mechanism of action that is commonly impaired in the general population via endogenous arginine deficiency, glycine deficiency, or MTHFR polymorphism. So the MTHFR gene encodes for an enzyme called methyl N-tetrahydrofolate reductase. I always have a hard time saying that one. Or MTHFR. This enzyme is needed to create DNA and support methylation pathways that are essential for all bodily functions. Genetic variations in this gene result in reduced activity of the enzyme and has been associated with cardiovascular disease, neurological defects, some forms of cancer, and a myriad of other diseases and disorders. According to demographic research, methylation impairing polymorphisms are quite prevalent. Personally, I am homozygous for C677T of MTHFR, which results in approximate 70% decrease of the expected MTHFR enzyme activity and an 80 to 90% decrease in my efficiency in processing folic acid. The direct reflection of that in blood biomarkers can be high homocysteine, low B12, or low folate levels. And I determine this via simple 23andMe genetics test. You could check your SNPs as well yourself if you want to. It doesn't need to be 23andMe. A lot of services exist that can do this. Of note as well, there are other SNPs in the MTHFR gene that can compound this to an even greater magnitude than the inhibition that I have. And you would find this out via, assessing your raw data and plugging it in and cross-referencing. But at the end of the day, it's relatively common for some level of inhibition, but also just dietary deficiencies in general. So upwards of 45% of your body's methylation demands are used to synthesize creatine. Another 45% is used for phosphatidylcholine synthesis, and the remaining 10% is used for an array of other processes. And for someone like myself with a MTHFR polymorphism, you can deplete far more methyl groups than is ideal to create that 1 gram of creatine that you endogenously synthesize. So for those with significantly impaired methylation, supplementing with creatine is likely the only way creatine replenishment to the maximum storage capacity can be achieved. One study found that supplementing with 5 grams of creatine per day lowered homocysteine levels by almost 50% in the subject who is homozygous for C677T of MTHFR, same thing I have. Creatine supplementation can significantly lower the body's demand for methylation and prevent the depletion of methyl groups. This is one of the main reasons why I personally supplement with creatine every day. Also, aside from the performance enhancing properties we've already discussed, optimizing homocysteine is yet another indirect benefit of creatine supplementation that can actually augment nitric oxide mediated vasodilation, improving pumps and performance, which we'll get into the mechanism shortly in more elaborate detail when we discuss betaine, trimethylglycine. But a lot of people don't realize their creatine usage could actually be indirectly augmenting nitric oxide pathways as well. So why include creatine in a pre-workout if its effects accumulate? This is a criticism of creatine I occasionally see. Personally, I know that every extra thing I have to remember to drink on a daily basis gets very annoying and results in a much lower likelihood of me adhering to the protocol ultimately. Like for example, collagen, that's another powder that we have via Gorilla Mind. It tastes great, but it's just another thing for me to remember to mix, take daily, and oftentimes I just neglect it because I can only make so many things in a day before I'm like, fuck it, I don't want to touch another supplement. For capsules, it's pretty easy because I can just fit them in my capsule thing, toss them, wash them, good to go. But with drinking something, even if it tastes good, having to remember to go in, scoop something, mix it up, slug it, it gets annoying when you have a bunch of different products after a while. So, personally, I know every single extra thing at this point in my personal routine is just like much less likelihood I'm going to adhere to it. And ultimately, almost everybody who is using pre-workout at the end of the day is also going to be supplementing with creatine, or they would be if they had good adherence. So it is almost certainly being the most impactful ergogenic supplement you can include in your daily routine. Even if you are getting it in your pre-workout, you are getting it in is the point. So you don't have to go buy it separately, or remember to take it separately on days that you take it in your pre-workout. It is an efficiency thing, in my opinion, and just like helping people get on creatine who otherwise wouldn't have. There's absolutely a minority of individuals that I can acknowledge get GI distress from creatine supplementation in any capacity. And for those individuals, I could see why creatine in a pre-workout could be problematic, but that's also kind of one of the main reasons we made Gorilla Mode base earlier in the year was people who want the infrastructure of the Gorilla Mode formula without creatine and without some of the bells and whistles and whatnot. So for everyone else though, creatine is almost certainly going to be the most impactful supplement you can add to your daily routine, and is why we also carry it separately in multiple different formats: powders, capsules, 30 serve powder, 100 serve powder. But regardless of where it comes from, most people will be taking it daily. And having it simplified so you don't need to remember to add it separately. Also, it tasting great via this format rather than just being like plain powder, mixing well, etc. Like even 5 years later, after including the 5 gram dose in the 1.0 2019, I still feel like this is a worthwhile integration to save money, increase adherence, and significantly augment performance and body composition. Like ultimately, you can't argue with the fact that 5 grams of creatine monohydrate, it's like one of the most impactful ingredients in the formula. And there will be some people that are on creatine because of the pre-workout, ultimately, indirectly. And yeah, you're not gonna be taking it every single day because you're not gonna take a pre-workout every single day, but on those days that you're taking it, like you're getting your dose in, and it's less days you have to remember to take a separate dose, fortunately. So, you know, ultimately, I think it is a worthwhile integration and still one of the most impactful bang for your buck supplements you could possibly be using. And on the days that you use pre-workout, you don't need to remember to take it separately, and it's nice. So there is some literature suggesting that creatine supplementation as well around the workout may be superior for assimilation into muscle. So that could also be a potential benefit for taking it with your pre-workout as well. But in general, the aforementioned points discussed are the main justification for its inclusion, in my opinion. We'll get into the timing now, because that is it's worth talking about at least briefly. So exercise has shown to enhance creatine accrual in muscles. Question commonly asked, does timing of when you take your creatine matter? There are a few studies supporting the importance of timing of it peri-workout, but other data are contradictory too. So this is likely due to differing supplementation protocols, training protocols, sample populations. In general, more well-controlled studies are needed to determine whether timing matters at all, but ultimately, I think you're just fine taking it whenever you take it during the day, so as long as you get it in, regardless if there's additional benefits of taking creatine in gorilla mode pre-workout compared to taking it, you know, at another time of day. The main point at the end of the day is increased adherence and convenience, which will in turn lead to a higher likelihood of optimal results. And it's just like a value prop too. At the end of the day, you are getting your creatine in here that you don't need to buy separately, or at least you need to use less separately because you are getting it on most days of the week or however many days a week you use pre. Do you need to cycle off of creatine? No, you don't need to cycle off of creatine. Your body does not get used to it. And long-term use has shown to be safe in healthy adults. A notable trial, I think worth mentioning to showcase how significant the safety profile is. In a randomized clinical trial assessing the effect of creatine monohydrate on clinical progression in patients with Parkinson's disease, participants were randomized to placebo or 10 grams creatine monohydrate per day. The typical dose that most people are taking is 3 to 5 grams for a minimum of 5 years. So Parkinson's disease patients taking 10 grams of creatine for 5 years straight. Long-term creatine use did not appear to adversely affect renal function or body mass index, and the 10 grams per day dose was determined to be generally well tolerated. And this is in a, you know, like sick population essentially. So, you know, for the average healthy individual, like, no, it's not a concern whatsoever. Does creatine cause kidney damage? Another concern many people have. Today, even after over 20 years of research, there is no evidence of kidney damage from recommended dosages of creatine supplements. The following systematic review and meta-analysis evaluating 290 non-duplicated studies assessing the effects of creatine supplementation on renal function indicated that creatine supplementation does not induce renal damage in the studied amounts and durations. The literature appears to be extremely favorable, even at doses exceeding 5 grams, where some may need to dose it to realize the maximum benefit. If you have compromised kidneys, more careful considerations will need to be taken if you should supplement with creatine or not, but for healthy individuals, it appears to have a great safety profile. What is the optimal creatine dosage? Should everyone use 5 grams per day? In most studies, a loading protocol of around 0.3 grams per kilogram of body weight per day was utilized for 5 to 7 days, followed by a daily maintenance dose of at least 0.03 grams per kilogram of body weight. So for an 180-pound person, 82 kilograms, this equates to a loading phase dosage of 25 grams per day and a maintenance dose of at least 2.5 grams per day thereafter. Alternatively, taking a 3 to 5 gram dose of creatine per day without a loading phase will still reach the same net outcome in most individuals. It just takes a bit longer to reach saturation. And this is where the 5 gram per day dosage most of us have been told to follow derived from. What most don't know though is that larger athletes engaged in intense training may need to consume 5 to 10 grams per day of creatine to maintain optimal or capacity whole body creatine stores, and clinical populations may need to consume 10 to 30 grams per day throughout their lifespan to offset creatine synthesis deficiencies and or provide therapeutic benefit in various disease states. Even long-term, high-dose ingestion of creatine up to 30 grams per day for up to 5 years in patient populations has not been associated with an increased incidence of renal dysfunction. We've been told for years, use 5 grams of creatine per day. Regardless of your size, gender, age, diet, take 5 grams. That's what we've been told, what we were led to believe for years. And more recently, it's interesting to see some of this clinical literature emerge around like the 10 plus gram per day dose, the longer term studies, also larger athletes getting benefits above 5 grams. In general, for most people, 5 grams per day, reasonable recommendation, will result in saturation for most people. However, some individuals may benefit from a higher dose, and I think it's worth finding out if you're one of those individuals. So at minimum, with Gorilla Mode or Gorilla Mode Nitric, or a combination of the two, it'll provide the typical saturation dose of creatine, so then you don't need to remember to take it separately on days you're training unless you're one of the individuals who can push past the typical 5 gram per day dosage. The next ingredient in the formula to cover is L-Tyrosine at 5,000 milligrams. So this is a huge bump up from Gorilla Mode 1. That was at 1,500, up another 3,500 milligrams to get up to 5,000. So L-Tyrosine is an amino acid that is used by the body to produce proteins, neurotransmitters, including dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. These neurotransmitters play important roles in regulating mood, energy levels, and stress response. Anecdotally, L-Tyrosine tends to be taken in doses of 500 to 2,000 milligrams 30 to 60 minutes before cognitively demanding work or exercise. And before we get into some of the literature, I feel it's worthwhile to highlight the pathway for catecholamine and traceamine synthesis. The following is a visual representation of the pathway for catecholamine and traceamine synthesis in the human brain. All catecholamines are synthesized from the amino acid L-tyrosine in the following sequence: L-tyrosine to L-dopa, levodopa, to dopamine, which then converts to norepinephrine, noradrenaline, which then converts to epinephrine, adrenaline. So you can see this cascade. Supplementing with L-tyrosine has shown to have potential benefits for cognitive function, particularly in stressful or fatigue-inducing environments, by increasing the synthesis of these mentioned neurotransmitters. Now, moving on to some of the literature, the effects of L-tyrosine supplementation on reaction time and vigilance. L-tyrosine usage acutely augments reaction time and vigilance and has been shown to attenuate performance impairments by high levels of environmental stress. The effects of L-tyrosine supplementation on memory and military tracking performance. Several studies have shown that L-tyrosine supports working memory even during periods of extreme stress. In a unique study, L-tyrosine was given to 21 cadets during a demanding military combat training course. The cadets supplied with L-tyrosine performed better on a memory and tracking test and markedly enhanced stress resilience, reaction time, vigilance, sustainment of cognitive performance in the face of extreme pressure. Obviously has practical utility in an array of sports, both in training and in game. And a lot of these studies evaluating the extreme stress exposure and L-tyrosine's attenuation of the response to that and the ability to deal with it more efficiently and more capably. Very notable, in my opinion, especially for athletics. Now we're going to look at how L-tyrosine stacks up to amphetamines. Yes, it's an interesting study. Dextroamphetamine versus L-tyrosine supplementation for attenuating cognitive performance deficits due to prolonged sleep deprivation. So dextroamphetamine is one of the 2 amphetamine formats in Adderall. Dextroamphetamine comprises, I believe, 75% of Adderall, and then 25% is levoamphetamine. Or if you get Dexedrine, that's like 100% dextroamphetamine. So how does it stack up to L-tyrosine? L-tyrosine usage has been shown to overcome certain cognitive performance deficits due to prolonged sleep deprivation, including running memory, logical reasoning, mathematical processing, and visual vigilance. In this study, 76 healthy male volunteers who ranged in age from 18 to 35 were sleep deprived for 30 hours and then given either placebo, dextroamphetamine, phentermine, caffeine, or L-Tyrosine, and metrics of cognitive performance were assessed. While tyrosine did not perform as well as dextroamphetamine in some tasks, which is expected, like literally compared to a pharmaceutical amphetamine, it still attenuated cognitive performance deficits in several metrics caused by sleep deprivation and actually outperformed dextroamphetamine in mathematical processing at the 1.5 hour post-administration mark and logical reasoning task assessment at the 5.5 hour post-administration mark. Logical reasoning is a mental activity that aims to arrive at a conclusion in a rigorous manner. In the study, the logical reasoning performance measures were response latency per response and number of errors per session. So for a natural compound with a really good safety profile, very promising outcome. Like we're comparing it to literal amphetamines here. So that was a very cool study to see. Moving on to the effects of L-tyrosine supplementation on cognitive flexibility. In a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled design study, 22 healthy adults performed in a task-switching paradigm. Administration of 2,000 milligrams of L-tyrosine was shown to promote cognitive flexibility, the ability to switch between thinking about two different concepts or to think about multiple concepts simultaneously. Moving on to the effects of L-tyrosine supplementation on endurance in heat, a more athletics-focused application. Increased brain dopamine availability improves prolonged exercise tolerance in the heat. Because tyrosine is the amino acid precursor to dopamine, it has been theorized that supplementing with it could enhance exercise capacity in the heat and make you be able to have superior work output in a stressful environment and high temperatures. One study evaluated this by giving young, healthy, moderately trained male volunteers either 500 milliliters of a flavored sugar-free drink, placebo, or the same drink infused with 150 milligrams per kilogram of tyrosine in a double-blind manner 1 hour before cycling to exhaustion at a constant exercise intensity equivalent to 68% peak oxygen uptake, VO2 peak, in 30 degrees Celsius and 60% relative humidity. Each volunteer performed both exercise trials separated by at least 7 days in a randomized crossover design. They found that when the individuals were dosed with tyrosine 1 hour before cycling, they were able to cycle over 11 minutes longer than when they took the placebo drink. So 80.3 minutes versus 69.2 with and without. The results showed that acute tyrosine supplementation is associated with increased endurance capacity in the heat, and that tyrosine can influence the ability to subjectively tolerate prolonged submaximal constant load exercise in the heat. Moving on to the next ingredient in the formula, we have betaine anhydrous, also known as trimethylglycine at 4,000 milligrams. So that is up from 2,500 in mode 1.0 to 4,000 in mode 2.0, matching the potency of what it has been in nitric this whole time. So betaine, also called trimethylglycine, acts as a methyl donor and an osmolate in the body. I think betaine is a widely misunderstood ingredient for what it can do, and I have some new insights that I've accumulated over the years that I think not only further reinforce its viability as an adjunct ingredient in a pre-workout, but in addition, just provide some unique and interesting insight into its different unique applications and mechanisms of action. As an osmolate, betaine protects cells from dehydration, balances fluid levels inside and outside of the cells, and can enhance intracellular water retention. As a methyl donor, betaine provides a methyl group to guanidinoacetate acetate via methionine that can synthesize creatine in skeletal muscle. Earlier in the creatine breakdown, I briefly outlined the importance of having enough methyl donors available for methylation-mediated processes in the body, including the endogenous synthesis of creatine. For some individuals, depending on PEMT gene variations, betaine can substitute for folate and B12 in the regeneration of methionine and can be choline sparing via this mechanism. It can also provide additional needed methyl donors when over-depletion occurs in genetically predisposed individuals that don't supplement with creatine or have other deficiencies. Ideally, you don't need to do that or end up in that situation because you would just be, diet would be dialed, you'd be supplementing with creatine, etc. But that is notable as far as mechanism. So getting into the effects on muscular strength, power, and size of betaine supplementation first off. A randomized double-blind placebo-controlled crossover trial examined the ergogenic effects of betaine supplementation 1.25 grams taken twice per day on strength and power performance in an array of high-intensity strength / power resistance exercises, including bench press, squat, and jump tests. Subjects were matched accordingly to age, body size, and training experience before their random placements into either the betaine supplementation or placebo groups for 14 days. Special attention was given to dietary and activity control among and within subjects. Subjects submitted 3-day diet records and 6-week activity reports, and all subjects reported similar physical activity and diet before each exercise test and throughout study participation. A standardized whole body resistance training session was performed twice during the supplementation periods to maintain the subject's level of conditioning, and subjects were instructed to refrain from any exercise for 48 hours before the performance testing sessions. After 14 days in the betaine group, isometric bench press force increased up to 24.61%. Isometric bench press throw power increased up to 15.97%. Isometric squat force increased up to 21.43%, and vertical jump power increased up to 14.22%. The placebo group had no improvement in those performance metrics. Another randomized double-blind placebo-controlled crossover trial examined the effect of betaine supplementation, 1.25 grams taken twice per day, on cycling sprint performance. Subjects included resistance-trained men and women who are match-paired based on baseline maximum peak power and assigned to either betaine or placebo group for 7 days. There was no training involved during the supplementation period. The initial supplementation period was followed by a 3-week washout phase, and then subjects were assigned to the opposite group for another 7 days. The maximum peak power during a cycling sprint test was increased by 5.75% after supplementation with betaine, with no difference in power in the placebo group from baseline. Another study investigated the effects of long-term betaine supplementation, 1.25 grams twice per day, on body composition, performance, and homocysteine thiolactone in experienced strength-trained men. Subjects were tested prior to and following 6 weeks of treatment. Arm and thigh cross-sectional area was estimated via girth and skin fold measurements. Bone density was estimated via skin fold calipers and used to estimate body fat percentage, fat mass, and lean body mass. Performance was assessed via vertical jump, bench press 1 rep max, and back squat 1 rep max. Arm size significantly increased in the betaine group, but not placebo group. Bench press training volume was significantly improved in the betaine group compared to the placebo group at microcycles 1 and 3. Body fat percentage, fat mass, and lean body mass improved significantly in the betaine group, but not in the placebo group. No differences were found in performance variables between groups, except there was a trend for increased vertical jump power in the betaine group versus the placebo group. A significant interaction existed for homocysteine thiolactone with increases from baseline to week 2 in the placebo group, but not in the betaine group. Additionally, homocysteine thiolactone remained elevated at week 4 in the placebo group, but not in the betaine group. It is speculated that these results are achieved primarily through the osmolytic effects of betaine and its attenuation of lactate increases during exercise. Despite featuring an array of attributes, the most consistently replicated and reliable effect in the studies available on betaine is its potent reduction of homocysteine, which indirectly plays an integral role in vasodilation capacity and performance. This is the other vector of betaine, often not discussed, that supports its position as a supportive pump agent outside of its inherent osmolytic effects. The effects of betaine supplementation on homocysteine and what I like to call the vasodilation brick wall. Research has shown that betaine supplementation may reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease as well as improve digestion and liver function. One of the primary ways it facilitates a cardioprotective effect is proposed to be its acute and dose-dependent effect on plasma homocysteine concentrations. So optimizing vasodilation isn't just about hammering yourself with nitric oxide precursors. It's also about optimizing the clearance of vasoconstrictors or attenuating their activity. An optimal approach to not just gym performance, but broad spectrum health accounts for all angles, in my opinion. And homocysteine is very impactful on blood pressure and cardiovascular health. Elevated homocysteine impairs the clearance of something called asymmetric dimethylarginine, ADMA. This is a biomarker that is assessed not commonly, but it is becoming more widely known for its being a proxy for vasodilation potential, which we'll get into now. Nitric oxide synthases, NOSs, are a family of enzymes catalyzing the production of nitric oxide from L-arginine. ADMA is a naturally occurring endogenous inhibitor of nitric oxide synthase. So ADMA competes with L-arginine for NOS, nitric oxide synthase, and as a result, the expression of nitric oxide decreases. So almost think of it like a anti-androgen of sorts, like anabolic steroid, testosterone competing for the androgen receptor. If you have an anti-androgen competing for it, it attenuates the capacity of testosterone to do what it does and impart gene expression. So ADMA competes with arginine for NOS. So by inhibiting nitric oxide formation, ADMA causes endothelial dysfunction, vasoconstriction, elevation of blood pressure, and aggravation of atherosclerosis. Elevated plasma ADMA concentration has been identified as an independent risk factor for progression of atherosclerosis, cardiovascular death, and all-cause mortality. Homocysteine can be lowered, though, via adequate intake of bioactive B vitamins, and in some individuals, betaine can be very impactful as well. A single dose of orally administered betaine has an acute and dose-dependent reduction in plasma homocysteine concentrations, even among healthy individuals with normal homocysteine levels. So it's not just in those who are really sick with super high levels, it's even in those who are healthy with normal levels. Not only does betaine help regulate cellular hydration and lower lactate, but it also potently lowers homocysteine concentrations, which in turn enhances net vasodilation potential. So if you have an influx of NO precursors, L-Citrulline, nitrosogene, nitrates, like whatever it is, but ADMA is preventing NO synthesis, it may not even matter what you throw at your body. Like a systemic production limit threshold is not optimally overcome simply by adding more substrate. Rather, it would be via attenuating the NO inhibiting blockade while concurrently increasing NO precursors for NO synthesis, thus resulting in like a 1 + 1 = 3 effect on vasodilation. So you would ideally want to increase the capacity for production via substrate, but also make sure there is nothing on the back end inhibiting it from working, because otherwise you're just fighting a losing battle. It's like the anti-androgen example I gave, hopefully is something that could be an analogous illustration of what I'm talking about. Or even like an aromatase inhibitor, preventing estrogen from being produced. Even if you have a ton of testosterone, that would normally aromatize into tons of estrogen. If you have an aromatase inhibitor that is like competing for the enzyme, it doesn't really matter how much substrate you have if it can't interact with the enzyme appropriately. So with that, the question then arises, what is the optimal dose of betaine, trimethylglycine? Because we know it has a dose-dependent reduction on homocysteine. So is more better? What is the best dose? So what we do know is more isn't always better. There is a sweet spot threshold, and that is what we are at in our new formula. So Gorilla Mode 1.0 had 2.5 grams, as that was what's shown in the performance athletics literature to be enhancing. It's efficacious at 1.25 grams twice per day, 2.5 grams per day. That's what we had in here. However, in nitric, we've had the 4-gram dose since launch. Reason being is this is the dosage that can dose dependently also lower homocysteine to an extent that will not only attenuate to the maximum capacity possible the NO inhibiting component, but also not induce side effects. So we'll get into that now. So this is one of the most integral components of our pre-workout formulas. So given that, and given the literature that I hopefully elucidated adequately just now about ADMA and homocysteine and NO competition, NOS competition for NO synthesis. That is where the 4-gram dose is the sweet spot, and we integrated it into the mode upgrade to match. So being, one of the most useful ingredients in the formula, and it being the sweet spot, in this upgrade, we felt it worthwhile to match it to nitric. So in general, the utility of betaine in mode is to support cellular integrity, fluid dynamics, attenuate exercise-induced lactate elevations, and also lower homocysteine levels to lower ADMA-mediated NOS competition. So what happens when you go above 4 grams? So no higher dosage than 4 grams per day has shown to exhibit greater ergogenic properties. We already know the dosages for that, or 2.5 grams per day based on the athletics literature. However, when you look at the cardiovascular disease literature and the vasodilation capacity enhancement literature, dosages above 4 grams have shown to do something else, which is adversely impact lipid profiles. A 2022 systematic review and meta-analysis found that 4 grams per day expectedly lowered homocysteine, but that was the threshold dose for long-term safety, as adverse effects on lipid profiles began when the dose exceeded 4 grams per day. So that is where you get the sweet spot of homocysteine reductions, inhibition of ADMA-mediated NOS competition to maximize vasodilation potential via the substrate you're actually providing, but also not pushing into lipid dyslipidemia territory where you could end up with making yourself potentially more unhealthy via higher dosage. It's tough to say exactly what happens if you go above 4 grams, but in general, the net on it via the systematic review and meta-analysis data has supported that 4 grams is the sweet spot. Anything above it is risky territory for long-term use. And we already know that 2.5 grams is the lower threshold for athletics. So it's like, okay, well, somewhere between 2.5 and 4 is where you can escalate in order to max out the cardiovascular vasodilation capacity benefits. And above that, you're in risk territory that probably doesn't make a lot of sense for long-term safety. So that is where the 4-gram dose comes from and why it is integrated into both Gorilla Mode and Gorilla Mode Nitric. And going above it does not yield any additional benefit that is worthwhile of the risk profile. Moving on to the next ingredient in the formula, we have Hydroprime, glycerol powder, 65% at 4,000 milligrams. So we had Glycerpump at 3 grams in mode 1.0. Now it's in Hydroprime format for the reasons mentioned earlier in the video about stability, being more resilient to environmental factors, better consistency, mixability, blah, blah, blah. Dosage is now 4 grams. Matches the dosage that is in nitric as well, which was always the 4-gram dose. So glycerol supplementation has shown to enhance performance primarily through its ability to promote hyperhydration and improve thermoregulation. The use of glycerol with enough water provides an osmotic drive that augments the retention of large quantities of water, which would otherwise be eliminated by the kidneys. Glycerol use pre-workout has become a popular adjunct ingredient for enhancing pumps and endurance via this hyperhydrating effect. And similarly to betaine, the dosage was increased to match the potency of nitric from 3 to 4 grams. How does this affect the pre-workouts in terms of net outcome? And what data can we refer to actually see the literature-backed evidence of its utility? So IV infusion of fluids versus oral glycerol supplementation for enhancing endurance. This is the first notable piece of content I feel worthwhile to dig into. This study showed intravenous infusion of fluids results in physiologic changes during exercise that are associated with improved performance. I think we all expected that. Literally IVing fluids into yourself, you can imagine, would be helpful. Some of these changes include reduced heart rate, expanded plasma volume, and lowered core temperature. But seeking, supplements that could otherwise replicate the effects of something that you probably aren't going to do reliably, consistently, like how many people are going to IV themselves with fluids before a workout? It's like almost nobody. So a study was conducted to assess whether oral glycerol supplementation could achieve similar results, thereby being a potential benefit under thermal stress. The comparisons show that glycerol not only reduced heart rate, decreased urine output, raised the sweat rate, and lowered temperature, but it also prolonged endurance time by as much as 24%, which was pretty damn impressive. And especially in comparison to having comparable metrics to IV infusion of fluids with some oral supplement. Pretty wild. So let's get into now the effects on aerobic and anaerobic performance of glycerol supplementation. A meta-analysis of the effects of glycerol-induced hyperhydration on fluid retention and endurance performance concluded that glycerol use significantly enhances fluid retention better than water alone, was associated with an increase in endurance performance and increased power output by 3%. Several studies have shown that increases in body water by 1 liter or more are achievable through glycerol use. More recent studies have also found that glycerol supplementation can increase both aerobic and anaerobic performance. Another interesting attribute, the synergistic effect of glycerol plus creatine. Glycerol and creatine are both effective supplements for enhancing cellular hydration. We mentioned earlier how creatine works. However, glycerol has whole body hydrating effects, whereas creatine retains fluid predominantly in the intracellular fluid compartments. And researchers, knowing this, hypothesized that a glycerol-induced increase in extracellular water coupled with a creatine-mediated increase in intracellular water could have synergistic effects, resulting in a much larger increase in total body water than if either was used on their own separately. So they assessed this by combining both supplements and then assessing if they could induce a greater level of hyperhydration than with either of them alone. They found that glycerol combined with creatine did produce a greater result than creatine alone, and the data suggests is an effective method of hyperhydration capable of reducing thermal and cardiovascular responses. So while this is almost certainly going to augment pumps and decrease the probability of injury in the gym, a substantial water retention could theoretically impair endurance performance through increasing body mass and consequently negatively impact the aerobic demands of running. A more recent study sought out to determine if that was indeed the case by assessing the effects of combined glycerol and creatine supplementation on thermoregulatory and cardiovascular responses and the amount of oxygen the body uses during running for 30 minutes at speed corresponding to 60% of VO2 max in hot and cool conditions. The results showed that the significant increase in body mass induced via combined glycerol and creatine supplementation did not significantly impact the oxygen cost of trained runners, thus supporting the use of effective hyperhydration strategies during endurance training. So the net effect, after all, was positive, and it had no negative impact on the aerobic demands of running, despite increased body water content. Hydration is one of the most critical factors when it comes to performance. It's a very known statistic, but if you haven't heard, body water losses of greater than 2% of body mass are defined as hypohydration, and as little as a 2% loss in water can decrease strength by approximately 2%, power by 3%, and high intensity endurance by 10%. Losses more than 5% of body weight can decrease work capacity by approximately 30%. Hyperhydration before exercise by means of ingesting water or carbohydrate/electrolyte solutions is less effective than IV infusion methods at acutely expanding plasma volume because most excess fluid is rapidly filtered and excreted by the kidneys. On the other hand, hydrating agents such as glycerol have been shown to effectively expand plasma volume, as glycerol mediates its effects in a way that cannot be replicated by electrolytes, carbohydrates, or creatine. It is another useful vector to lean on for augmenting cellular hyperhydration. Notably, it's more of a moderate novelty factor in a pre-workout scenario, and it features its highest utility in an endurance setting where hyperhydration is more worthwhile. But all that said, and all this data on its effects for endurance capacity and hyperhydrating for long distance running and whatever it may be used for most optimally, the pump can get pretty outrageous when combining all these supporting vectors in a pre-workout. And despite it being more of an endurance supplement ingredient, it is fun to use in the gym, and it can be more helpful during longer, more grueling workouts and hot temperatures and whatnot. But ultimately, the pump is pretty nasty with this stuff, and for the novelty factor alone, it's pretty cool. So glycerol dosage, what is the optimal dose? The max efficacious dose of glycerol is much higher than what can be included in a powdered pre-workout. Creating a stable glycerol powder is challenging and at high dosages can cause a gritty consistency. And this often prevents people from using a high dosage, as you can only mix so much glycerol powder in a shaker cup, and an absurd amount of powder simply won't sit well in the stomach. Now, this process has prevented us from adding the dosages we'd like in a pre-workout, so we included as much of a patented, stable, non-gritty glycerol powder as we could without the product turning into like an undrinkable monstrosity, essentially. So that is why we also created our own standalone glycerol products for those who want an even bigger pump than what is already provided in our pre-workouts, or for those, you know, that can benefit from hyperhydration in an endurance context, focus, which is its primary use case ultimately. So these are available as separate products, as you can see, in both powder. This is the liquid, this is the powder, in both liquid and powder formats. This is the HydroPrime glycerol powder. So this is more HydroPrime, plain, unflavored. You can add it to your pre-workouts. This is the liquid glycerol. So for convenience, the powder is excellent, as you can bring it on the go. You could just, hypothetically, if you had Gorilla Mode sitting dry in your shaker cup, you could add this to that and just carry it around the shaker cup and then mix it up when it's time to, take your pre later in the day. Convenience-wise, you can't beat the powder. However, to maximize efficacy, you would have to use liquid, because to truly replicate the doses found in the literature that have the most impactful effects on hyperhydration, this is unmatched. The dosages used in this, for example, one serving is 25 grams of active yield glycerol, whereas, for these, you're probably only going to be in the single-digit grams in your pre-workout before you start to get into GI distress territory. Now, that's not to say that it's not useful. It absolutely produces a marked difference. People can attest to the fact that HydroPrime in or out of a pre-workout, like a lot of people notice the difference. But ultimately, to get the dosages that are science-based for like heavy duty, you're holding like 1+ liter extra of water in your body, you'd be looking at the liquid. So anyway, that's on our site. Notable, why did we switch from GlycerPump to HydroPrime? I mentioned it earlier in the video, but worthwhile to touch on again in terms of just stability of powder and like how we arrived where we are. So glycerol powder, it's also just a kind of a trip down memory lane to show how far we've come, because we used to sell glycerol monostearate, which is just almost comical to think back. So glycerol powder is notoriously unstable, gritty, complete pain in the ass to mix without being a clumpy mess. If you've ever tried our OG glycerol monostearate powder that came in a jug like this, you can probably personally attest to this. To circumvent this, in 2019, during the inception of Gorilla Mode, we opted to use a trademarked version of glycerol called GlycerPump, which at the time was the best version on the market. It was great, served its purpose, allowed us to include a stable, high-yield glycerol powder in our pre-workout formulas. Then HydroPrime was released after and appears to have a superior stability profile, more resilient to environmental changes, etc. And that's why our standalone powder is HydroPrime glycerol powder and not GlycerPump. And it's also why we're switching to HydroPrime in all the pre-workouts. So this is HydroPrime, Gorilla Mode 1.0 was GlycerPump. So, if a better version comes out than HydroPrime, we'll switch to that when that comes. But as of now, this is the best in class glycerol powder, and it seems pretty damn good. So anyway, you can check that out on the website. Glycerol, very cool adjunct ingredient. Very cool novelty factor, I suppose, for bodybuilders, strength athletes. More useful in an actual ergogenic capacity for endurance athletes, though, notably. Moving on to the next ingredient in the formula, we have Alpha-GPC, 50% at 800 milligrams. L-alpha glycerol phosphorylcholine Alpha-GPC is the highest quality and most bioavailable form of choline that crosses the blood-brain barrier. Although basic choline bitartrate supplementation can be effective for increasing systemic choline concentrations, even high dosages of choline bitartrate have shown to have no cognitive effect in humans, suggesting that it is not crossing the blood-brain barrier and increasing neural choline levels. Alpha-GPC, on the other hand, has shown to cross the blood-brain barrier and provide the brain with rapidly absorbed choline. Choline is needed for the synthesis of cell membranes, lipid metabolism, DNA synthesis, homocysteine metabolism, as well as to produce acetylcholine. And the surge of quickly absorbed choline followed by the subsequent synthesis of acetylcholine helps support an array of functions, including but not limited to memory, focus, HGH production, and physical performance. The effects of alpha-GPC supplementation on memory, focus, and overall cognitive function. A 1993 randomized controlled study compared the efficacy of alpha-GPC and acetyl L-carnitine among 126 patients with probable cognitive decline, particularly memory loss. Alpha-GPC consistently showed favorable effects in improving neuro, psychological, and behavioral test scores of the patients. Improvements also occurred in the acetyl L-carnitine recipients, but to a lesser extent. Another study, a 2003 double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial conducted on 261 patients, found that alpha-GPC administration significantly improved memory and attention in older adults with cognitive impairment compared to a placebo group, and that alpha-GPC may be useful for improving cognitive function. The authors hypothesized that the clinical results gained with alpha-GPC may be ascribed to both its effects on neurotransmission and its activity in slowing the age-related loss of neuronal cells. In another study, a 2007 review of cholinergic precursors found that alpha-GPC administration appears to have a significant attenuative effect on the memory and attention impairment caused by neurodegenerative disorders. It also showed that 1,200 milligrams of alpha-GPC is more efficacious than donepezil is at the maximum recommended dose prescribed for patients with mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease. If you don't know, donepezil is a very potent pharmaceutical acetylcholinesterase inhibitor prescribed to Alzheimer's patients. So the fact that 1,200 milligrams of alpha-GPC outperformed it, quite notable in my opinion, and promising for its utility in a neurological support context. Another study, a 2008 study, found that alpha-GPC administration improved attention and reaction time in healthy young adults compared to a placebo group. So this isn't just, useful in the elderly and the cognitively declining. The researchers suggested that alpha-GPC may be useful for improving focus and attention in healthy individuals. In another study, 2015 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled crossover design study found that 200 milligrams of alpha-GPC improved concentration in young adults more than 200 milligrams of caffeine. Now moving on to the effects on HGH production, a lesser known attribute of alpha-GPC. How much can supplementation of it affect HGH production? A 2008 randomized placebo-controlled crossover design study featuring 7 men with at least 2 years of resistance training experience examined the effects of an alpha-GPC supplement on serum GH levels. Compared to baseline, peak GH levels increased 44-fold after alpha-GPC ingestion versus 2.6-fold after placebo ingestion. In another study, a 2012 double-blind randomized crossover study was designed to investigate acute physiologic responses to a single 1,000 milligram dose of alpha-GPC. Plasma GH levels were increased by approximately 290% 60 minutes after the oral administration of alpha-GPC. Moving on to its effects on force production and power output. What effect does alpha-GPC supplementation have on these metrics? Alpha-GPC has been shown to significantly improve force production and power output and may be an effective ergogenic aid. And this is where the main utility of it pre-workout comes in as a cholinergic agent. A study published in the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition investigated the effects of alpha-GPC supplementation on isometric strength in 19 healthy resistance-trained men. Participants had at least 1 year of resistance training experience and were required to have a current 1-rep max squat of at least 1.5 times their body weight. Participants were randomly assigned to either take 300 milligrams of alpha-GPC daily for 4 weeks or a placebo daily for 4 weeks. The study found that alpha-GPC supplementation resulted in a statistically significant increase in isometric strength compared to placebo. The alpha-GPC group had a 14.8% increase in isometric strength, while the placebo group had a 4.6% increase in isometric strength. In a 2008 randomized placebo-controlled crossover design study featuring 7 men with resistance training experience, examined the effects of an alpha-GPC supplement on explosive performance and post-exercise substrate oxidation. Each participant ingested 600 milligrams of alpha-GPC or a placebo 90 minutes prior to completing 6 sets with 10 repetitions per set of Smith machine squats at 70% of their predetermined 1 rep max. Compared to baseline, peak bench press force increased by 14% after alpha-GPC ingestion versus placebo. A 2015 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled crossover design study with 20 young participants, 10 males, 10 females, average 22 years of age, measured the acute effects of alpha-GPC supplementation on peak power output via a vertical jump test in comparison to caffeine or placebo. Vertical jump peak power was 8.5% higher than placebo after taking 200 milligrams of alpha-GPC, 7.5% higher than placebo after taking 400 milligrams of alpha-GPC, and 2% higher than placebo after taking 200 milligrams of caffeine. The same study also measured the acute effects of alpha-GPC supplementation on cognitive function in comparison to caffeine or placebo. One of the tests used to assess cognitive function metrics was the serial subtraction test, SST. The SST is a clinical test used to test cognition and concentration. The SST scores after taking 200 milligrams of alpha-GPC were 18.1% faster than after taking 200 milligrams of caffeine and 10.5% faster than after taking placebo. Another 2015 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled crossover design study was conducted to determine if 6 days of supplementation with alpha-GPC could augment isometric force production compared to placebo. 13 college-aged males used either 600 milligrams per day of alpha-GPC or placebo, and at the end of the 6 days performed isometric mid-thigh pulls and an upper body isometric test. Alpha-GPC had a significant effect on increasing isometric mid-thigh pull peak force. A 2017 study was designed to assess the efficacy of 250 milligrams of alpha-GPC and 500 milligrams of alpha-GPC in comparison to placebo and 200 milligrams of caffeine for increasing counter-movement jump performance, isometric strength, and psychomotor function. Group differences were noted for maximum velocity and maximum mechanical power on the counter-movement jump with the 250 milligram alpha-GPC group, demonstrating the greatest improvements in result. A depression in circulating TSH levels was noted with the 500 milligram dosage of alpha-GPC, suggesting that there may be significant satellite dopaminergic interplay, which is an interesting kind of side attribute potentially, as it is known that increased central dopamine levels reduce TSH levels. And if there is some sort of dopaminergic component, that kind of leads us naturally into the next segment, which is the effects of alpha-GPC supplementation on motivation levels. Alpha-GPC has more recently been shown to improve motivation levels, and there's some literature assessing this. A 2021 study conducted on 40 healthy volunteers, 31 females, 9 males, aged 22 to 59, assessed their emotional state in response to alpha-GPC supplementation. Participants were administered capsules containing either 200 milligrams of alpha-GPC or cellulose placebo. The participants self-administered 2 capsules once daily at bedtime for 2 weeks for a total daily dose of 400 milligrams alpha-GPC in the treatment group. The Kokoro scale was used to quantify and monitor changes in human feelings and emotions. This scale is a system applied in psychological surveys to evaluate emotional movement in the fields of academia, government, and industry. The placebo had no effect on motivation, whereas the alpha-GPC group showed an increased trend in motivation during the intervention period. Now, a very common comparison, and expectedly so, is alpha-GPC versus citicoline, also known as CDP choline. These are kind of the 2 heavy hitters in the realm of cholinergics and precursors. In general, the main reason we would use either alpha-GPC or citicoline, CDP choline, is to have them cross the blood-brain barrier and provide the brain with choline. While they are both effective, their composition differs and their ideal use case may differ as well. As per examine.com, alpha-GPC is 40% choline by weight. So 1,000 milligrams of alpha-GPC confers 400 milligrams choline and is a prodrug for both choline and glycerophosphate. Citicoline is a choline and uridine prodrug and readily dissociates into both free choline and cytidine following oral ingestion. And in humans, cytidine readily converts to uridine. It is 18.5% choline by weight, and 1,000 milligrams of citicholine confers 185 milligrams of choline. So when controlling for the amount of choline in each supplement, alpha-GPC is more effective on a per milligram basis than citicholine, and due to being relatively higher in choline on a weight basis, administration of the same doses of either compound result in the group given alpha-GPC experiencing a greater serum increase in choline. An open clinical trial carried out to compare the efficacy and the tolerability of 1,000 milligrams per day of alpha-GPC against 1,000 milligrams per day of citicholine found that in most tests, alpha-GPC possessed a statistical higher efficacy and overall more satisfactory activity assessed by both patients and investigators compared with citicholine. Alpha-GPC is considered to be a more effective cholinergic than both choline and citicholine when looking at serum values or benefit from clinical interventions. Alpha-GPC also has literature showing it can augment growth hormone response and peak force production during resistance training, whereas citicholine does not. In general, as well, anecdotes from reputable researchers also seem to enforce the superiority of alpha-GPC over CDP choline. Here's a quote by Rhonda Patrick, a PhD in biomedical science and expert on nutritional health and the brain and aging, for alpha-GPC versus CDP choline and her personal experience comparing the two.
I have personally tried alpha-GPC before at a dose of around 600 milligrams a day, an amount that is half the dose that was given to the demented patients in Mexico City, and I noticed that it did seem to improve my focus and attention. You should always leave a little room for the possibility that there may be a placebo effect, but since it's my anecdote, a smaller dose of 300 milligrams didn't really seem to have much of an effect on me. In general, I do not take alpha-GPC every day. I take it on rare occasions when I'm doing a lot of writing or if there's some sort of event that I'm speaking at. There is another popular form of choline called CDP choline, which is an intermediate produced during the generation of phosphatidylcholine from choline. There are a couple of human studies looking at the effects of CDP choline in cognitive function of healthy young or middle-aged adults, usually in the range of around 1,000 milligrams a day. The only benefits were seen in young adults that had poor processing speed and verbal memory tests at baseline. Strangely, those individuals that performed well at baseline actually had impaired performance after supplementation, which may have to do with genetic variants in the receptor density or something, which just sort of goes to show you how complicated neurobiology is and how even seemingly straightforward relationships can turn out to be not so straightforward. I have personally tried CDP choline and never really noticed any enhancing effect like I seem to with alpha-GPC.
So at the end of the day, I think citicholine is great, but in a pre-workout where enhanced motor unit recruitment and power output is the primary reason for the inclusion of cholinergics, alpha-GPC appears to be a superior choice. Like, it actually has force production data, it has greater outcomes in all measures of athletics that we can see and discern from literature available. It's kind of hard to argue with the higher yields, the actual relevant and applicable data for athletics and sports performance, and just in general, citicholine has not really outperformed alpha-GPC for anything that I've seen, nor for specific applications in a pre-workout. Especially alpha-GPC just seems to shine much more. Maybe citicholine will have some data come out on its effects on exercise, motor unit recruitment, etc., that makes it viable as well for pre-workout. But as far as I've seen, alpha-GPC is the go-to for pre-workout usage as the primary cholinergic you're going to rely on. How much choline do you need per day? The adequate intake, as established by the Food and Nutrition Board of the National Institute of Medicine for adults, is 550 milligrams per day for men and 425 milligrams per day for women. We all know how brutally low some AIs have proven to be in the past couple decades, and there's evidence suggesting that the AI for choline is also far too low. One study showed that 2,200 milligrams of choline per day protected against the DNA damage that otherwise occurred in people consuming only 550 milligrams per day. Here's a chart I created showing the milligrams of choline per 100 grams of food in descending order of concentration of the most potent concentrated sources, with beef liver at the top, secondary to that, veal liver, third, chicken liver. So liver in general is kind of like the heaviest hitting. And then the next closest thing that is not liver is egg. So I eat 1 ounce of beef liver per day, or if I'm traveling or just don't want to eat liver that day or haven't cooked it or whatever, I'll take 6 capsules of a beef liver supplement. This is when the viability of a beef liver supplement would actually be warranted, especially when I'm traveling. It's just way easier to do that. And I include eggs in my diet, as well as supplementation that I mentioned with the creatine, the betaine, etc. So how does choline affect methylation and health status? Normally, your body creates methyl groups by recycling homocysteine to methionine, as well as by converting choline to betaine. Here's the cycle. When nutrient intake needs are sufficiently met, the body depends on these 2 mechanisms equally. However, if you are deprived of methyl groups or have poor MTHFR activity because of a polymorphism like myself, you may create a disproportional ratio of dependency on the choline to betaine pathway. If you can't create enough methylfolate, your body will ramp up the use of betaine and choline for methyl groups. By ramping up choline to betaine conversion to support methylation, your body can become depleted of the choline it needs to create acetylcholine. Downstream, the depletion of choline can eventually lead to impaired cognitive function, DNA damage, and can be deleterious to overall health. The prevalence of MTHFR polymorphisms and micronutrient deficient diets is very common nowadays, and many people would benefit from changing their diet and or using some form of choline supplementation to maintain higher levels of choline. So I, as mentioned, supplement creatine, betaine, Alpha-GPC, a methylated B complex via our multivitamin as well. This is our elite multivitamin. It's a relatively new product to support general methylation, general health, and to support methylation specifically. This is a methylated B complex specifically designed for that, as well to enhance my cognitive and physical performance. That's kind of like my stack, if you will, to support my genetic predispositions and just backfill micronutrient dense deficiencies that may otherwise be present in the diet. If I was perfectly dialed genetically, maybe I wouldn't need to use a lot of this stuff, but the creatine, betaine, Alpha-GPC, fortunately, is just stuff that doubles via the pre-workout anyways. The methylated B vitamins, insurance policy, as is the multivitamin. So some of this stuff kind of like indirectly makes it into my stack anyways via, the pre-workout. If I'm taking creatine, betaine, and Alpha-GPC is kind of just inherently covered. Moving on to the next ingredient in the formula, 400 milligrams caffeine anhydrous. Caffeine is the most well-known central nervous system stimulant on Earth. It is well known for its potent effects on wakefulness, alertness, attentional performance, and power output. When a person is awake and alert, little adenosine is present in CNS neurons. Throughout the day, adenosine accumulates in the neuronal synapse, binding to and activating adenosine receptors found on certain CNS neurons. The activation of these adenosine receptors increases sleepiness. When caffeine is consumed, it binds to and antagonizes adenosine receptors, preventing adenosine from binding to and activating the receptor. As a result, caffeine temporarily prevents or relieves drowsiness and thus maintains or restores alertness. Gorilla Mode 1.0 had 350 milligrams of caffeine per max dose, whereas the updated formula now has 400 milligrams per max dose, or 200 milligrams per 1 scoop if you were going to do 1 scoop instead of 2. The effects of caffeine supplementation on strength and power. I felt like this was absolutely worth dissecting because a lot of misinformation on caffeine and also little known to the actual effective dosages, shockingly, because they get pretty high. For people who haven't actually dug into the literature, it's actually quite interesting to see how hard it's pushed to actually achieve the ergogenic effects at their max capacity. First up, we're going to talk about the 3 milligram per kilogram caffeine study in BJJ athletes. So a study conducted on elite Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu BJJ athletes assessed how impactful caffeine supplementation would be on BJJ specific muscular performance. In 2 different sessions, BJJ athletes ingested 3 milligrams per kilogram of caffeine or a placebo. After 60 minutes, they performed a hand grip maximal force test, a counter movement jump, a maximal static lift test, and bench press tests consisting of 1 rep maximum power load and repetitions to failure. In comparison to the placebo, the ingestion of the caffeine increased hand grip force in both hands by 4.7%, counter movement jump height by 2.7%, and 1 rep max bench press by 3.1%. Another study, 300 milligrams caffeine in young resistance-trained men. In a randomized controlled trial designed to assess the effect of caffeine on neuromuscular performance, 17 young resistance-trained men took 300 milligrams of caffeine or a placebo and were tested on their jump performance, muscle strength, and power. Caffeine acutely enhanced all performance metrics in the study. 600 milligram plus dose. 8 milligrams per kilogram caffeine in young resistance trained men. A 2022 crossover randomized double-blind placebo-controlled design study pushed the envelope by assessing the effect of high-dose caffeine, 8 milligrams per kilogram, on muscle strength of recreationally trained men. For a relatively average person weighing 185 pounds, that would equate to a caffeine dose of 671 milligrams. 21 males who already strength train, on average 5.1 hours per week, volunteered to participate. Inclusion criteria included being actively engaged in at least 4 hours per week of strength training for a year prior to the study, absence of any pathology or injury that would alter muscle biology and performance, be a non-smoker, and have a habitual daily intake of less than 150 milligrams per day of caffeine. 1 rep max on bench press. After taking 8 milligrams per kilogram of caffeine, 1 rep max bench press strength increased by 7.3%, going from 94.2 kilograms, 207.68 pounds, to 101.1 kilograms, 222.89 pounds. Almost an entire increment of going from a 35 on the side with the plate to 2 plates almost. Pretty impressive. 1 rep max on deadlift. After taking 8 milligrams per kilogram of caffeine, 1 rep max deadlift strength increased by 10%, going from 120.7 kilograms, 266.1 pounds, to 132.8 kilograms, 292.77 pounds. 1 rep max on squat. After taking 8 milligrams per kilogram of caffeine, 1 rep max squat strength increased by 9%, going from 119.4 kilograms, 263.23 pounds, to 130.1 kilograms, 286.82 pounds. Pretty damn significant jumps. A recent meta-analysis took 10 studies meeting the inclusion criteria necessary to evaluate the effects of caffeine intake on muscle strength and power. The meta-analyses showed significant ergogenic effects of caffeine ingestion on maximal muscle strength of upper body and muscle power. There are several other studies covering sprinters, swimmers, other strength tests that further illustrate significant strength and performance benefits. When it comes down to it, caffeine is included in pre-workouts because it reliably increases energy levels, provides CNS stimulation, and there is promising data supporting that it significantly improves performance. There are very few things that you can take that are as rigorously studied, have as favorable of a safety profile, and produce instant and significant results in performance. The effects of caffeine supplementation on workload when well slept versus sleep deprived. In a double-blind crossover study, 16 professional rugby players ingested either a placebo or 4 milligrams per kilogram of caffeine 1 hour before exercise. The effects of caffeine were assessed on well-slept, 8 hours or more, and sleep-deprived athletes, 6 hours or less. Athletes were asked to perform as many reps on each set as possible without failure. Sleep deprivation expectedly produced a very large decrease in total load, but caffeine ingestion in the sleep-deprived group was able to eliminate that loss of performance. Caffeine also resulted in a moderate increase in total load in the well-slept group. Notably, testosterone response to exercise increased with caffeine compared with placebo. The effects of caffeine supplementation on energy expenditure, calories burned per day. Single-dose oral administration of only 100 milligrams of caffeine increased the resting metabolic rate of both lean and post-obese human volunteers by 3 to 4% over 150 minutes. Repeated caffeine administration of 100 milligrams every 2 hours over a 12-hour span increased energy expenditure of both subject groups by 8 to 11%. The net effect was a significant increase in daily energy expenditure of 150 calories in lean volunteers and 79 calories in post-obese subjects. Commonly consumed doses of caffeine can have a significant impact on energy balance and improving body composition, was the conclusion here. The effects of caffeine supplementation on alertness, wakefulness, and readiness. Via adenosine receptor antagonism, caffeine can increase feelings of wakefulness, alertness, and arousal. Caffeine can delay or prevent sleep and improve task performance during sleep deprivation. Shift workers who use caffeine make fewer mistakes that could be a result of drowsiness. The effects of caffeine supplementation on attention and concentration. Caffeine can enhance cognitive performance on tasks that require sustained attention and concentration. This effect is thought to be related to caffeine's ability to increase the release of dopamine and norepinephrine, noradrenaline in the brain, which are neurotransmitters that play a role in attention and focus. A literature review of all available double-blind placebo-controlled studies that assessed acute effects of caffeine on attention tasks found that caffeine clearly improved performance on simple and on complex tasks. The effects of caffeine supplementation on working memory. Caffeine has been shown to improve working memory performance, which involves the ability to temporarily store information in the mind while solving a problem or performing a task. An example of a working memory task could be holding an address in mind while listening to instructions about how to get there. Caffeine also affects the cholinergic system, where it promotes acetylcholine release and acts as a moderate inhibitor of the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, thus inhibiting the breakdown of acetylcholine and influencing working memory and attention. The effects of caffeine supplementation on reaction time. Caffeine can improve reaction times, allowing people to respond more quickly to stimuli. One study conducted on sleep-deprived anesthesiology resident physicians assessed the effect caffeine had on their driving performance. Residency training in anesthesiology involves care of hospitalized patients and necessitates overnight work, resulting in altered sleep patterns and sleep deprivation. 26 residents participated in the study and were randomly chosen to either consume a 160 milligram caffeinated or a non-caffeinated energy drink 60 minutes before driving in a virtual reality simulator immediately after 6 consecutive night float shifts. After a subsequent week of night float work, residents performed the same driving session in a crossover fashion with the opposite intervention. Psychomotor vigilance task testing was used to evaluate reaction time and lapses in attention. After consuming a caffeinated energy drink on conclusion of 6 shifts of night float work, anesthesiology residents had improved control of driving performance variables in a high-fidelity driving simulator, including a significant reduction in collisions as well as slightly faster reaction times. The effects of caffeine supplementation on mental fatigue. Caffeine can reduce feelings of mental fatigue, making it easier to stay focused and engaged in cognitive tasks. What is the minimum effective dose of caffeine? The minimum effective dose of caffeine varies depending on several factors, including an individual's body weight, tolerance to caffeine, and sensitivity to its effects. Research suggests that the minimum effective dose of caffeine is likely around 40 to 50 milligrams, which is roughly equivalent to a small cup of coffee. However, other studies assessing just how low of a dose can yield positive effects have found that surprisingly low dosages still move the needle. A double-blind study measured the effects of 0, 12.5, 25, 50, and 100 milligrams of caffeine on cognitive performance, mood, and thirst in adults with low and moderate to high habitual caffeine intakes. 12.5 milligrams caffeine improved cognitive performance during both simple and stressful, demanding tasks. This amount of caffeine is equivalent to about a quarter of a serving of tea and less than a quarter of a serving of coffee. On a body weight basis, 12.5 milligrams equated to 0.18 milligrams per kilogram. At the time, that was reported to be the lowest dose of caffeine to reliably affect cognitive performance in human adults. So that begs the question, what is the caffeine dose necessary for enhanced mental or physical performance? Following low, approximately 40 milligrams or 0.5 milligrams per kilogram, to moderate, 300 milligrams approximately, or 4 milligrams per kilogram, caffeine doses, alertness, vigilance, attention, and reaction time improve. However, less consistent effects are observed on memory and higher order executive functions such as judgment and decision making. In terms of physical performance, the minimum effective dose of caffeine for improving metrics such as time to exhaustion, muscle strength, endurance, and high intensity sprints has been shown to be about 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, or roughly 200 to 400 milligrams for a 150 pound, 68 kilogram person. Very high doses of caffeine, for example, 9 milligrams per kilogram, are associated with a high incidence of side effects and do not seem to be required to elicit an ergogenic effect. All that said, it's worth noting that some people may experience both cognitive and physical performance benefits at much lower dosages, while others may need a much higher dosage to see an effect. Generally, healthy adults can safely consume up to 400 milligrams of caffeine per day. However, that doesn't mean that you need to use that high of a dose. Use caffeine as needed relative to your individual tolerance. Even if you think you're, pretty well adjusted to pre-workout, it's probably worth starting with a half scoop to 1 scoop at most to assess your tolerance, maybe even less. And then you would titrate up accordingly. In general, it's a bit of a individual gauging before you get your optimal dose dialed in. Like if you're a jittery and anxious mess from taking 400 milligrams, despite the fact that there's studies showing like, oh, this is where the ergogenic properties kick in the most, it's probably going to hinder your performance more than help you in the gym if you're, using a dose that is over the top for your own personal threshold of stimulation of what you can withstand. So just take these studies with a grain of salt and keep it relative. For some, starting with as low as half a scoop of Gorilla Mode, 100 milligrams of caffeine plus the other complementary nootropics in it, may be more than enough to achieve topped out cognitive stimulation without getting jitters or other caffeine-induced side effects. But in general, I would say 1 scoop, 200 milligrams caffeine will be the sweet spot for a lot of people. And for those with higher caffeine tolerance, the maximum daily dose of Gorilla Mode, 400 milligrams of caffeine, should cover your bases in conjunction with the other nootropics in the formula, like even if you're a high stim guy. For those who want the max efficacious dose of the non-cognitive enhancing ingredients in Gorilla Mode though, like the pump ingredients, vasodilation, hyperhydrating, etc. ingredients, but can't handle the amount of stimulants or nootropics in 2 scoops of Mode, that's where combining Mode and Nitric would be ideal. So our stim-free formula with our Swiss Army knife stacked with nootropics and stims formula. Should you wait 90 minutes after waking up to take caffeine? Interesting question, and something many people have started to implement and encourage as well is delaying the intake of caffeine for 90 to 120 minutes after waking up. The logic behind this approach is to prevent an afternoon crash that purportedly occurs if caffeine is taken upon waking. This is hinged on the relationship between adenosine and cortisol and the purported natural clearance of adenosine that is incomplete upon waking, which isn't actually the case, but it is also said that adenosine flooding the receptors will be more likely to cause a sleepiness rebound effect and the crash, if you call it, if you ingest caffeine shortly after waking up, whereas you can avoid that adenosine rebound by delaying caffeine intake for 1.5 to 2 hours. So I feel like it's worthwhile to talk about the adenosine and cortisol diurnal rhythm and just understand how they work. So to evaluate the validity of, this theory, should we delay our intake? It's best to evaluate really what these levels look like on a 24-hour basis of cortisol and adenosine of the average healthy person. So adenosine levels are highest when you go to sleep. And as you sleep, adenosine levels start to decrease and cortisol levels bottom out during the first half of the night. In the latter half, cortisol levels start to ramp up and adenosine levels are at the lowest point of the day right before you wake up, and they start immediately increasing again after waking, subsequently building up sleep pressure over the course of the day, and cortisol levels peak shortly after you wake up. Specifically in healthy individuals, there's typically a spike and peaking in cortisol levels within 15 to 45 minutes of waking up. This increase in cortisol signals the body to mobilize and get going, and cortisol then declines steadily over the day thereafter, while adenosine has already been increasing since waking up, and the cycle repeats itself on a 24-hour basis. When caffeine is consumed, It binds to and antagonizes adenosine receptors, preventing adenosine from binding to whatever capacity, relative to your dose, adenosine receptor density, etc. Myriad of factors, but ultimately that's the mechanism. This action temporarily inhibits drowsiness and helps maintain or restore alertness. As caffeine use increases both adrenocorticotropin, ACTH, and cortisol secretion, it has been speculated that delaying caffeine ingestion until 90 to 120 minutes after waking will allow an individual to take advantage of their natural endogenous cortisol spike in the morning and then kind of cruise through the afternoon without any crash that could otherwise be caused by a flooding of the adenosine receptors as caffeine is eliminated. No literature exists that I'm aware of supporting that an afternoon crash is an expected outcome after caffeine intake. Doesn't mean we should disregard it though, especially if many people have noted this now anecdotally. But the first consideration I would make regarding this theory is that over time with regular use, which is how most people use caffeine, the caffeine-mediated cortisol spike appears to be blunted or eliminated entirely. In addition, adenosine is not decreasing more over those 90 minutes. On the contrary, adenosine is lowest when you wake up. It increases thereafter, building up sleep pressure over the day, but there is no adenosine clearance occurring after waking, where it's like still working its way out of your system as cortisol is going up. Like adenosine is at its lowest, and now the sleep pressure begins to rise upon waking. Typically, caffeine is taken to achieve a higher level of cognitive function, vigilance, sports performance, or general wakefulness. For most daily users, I speculate that delaying caffeine intake for 1.5 to 2 hours is probably just delaying you getting the effects you want and making it more likely to impede your sleep quality later. Even if this afternoon crash existed, the total daily caffeine dosage could also be split up to allow for redosing. I speculate that most, but maybe not all, but most afternoon caffeine crashes are driven primarily through individual specific lifestyle, sleep hygiene, diet, exercise, or caffeine dose and duration of exposure, and are kind of like minimally influenced by adenosine flooding the receptors just hours after caffeine ingestion. The half-life of caffeine is 3 to 7 hours in healthy adults. Most people, the half-life is going to be closer to 5 hours on average. It has been reported that the average caffeine intake for Americans is 165 to 230 milligrams per day. And 12.5 milligrams, as we saw, of caffeine has been shown to impart cognitive effects in studies, and 40 milligrams is all that is needed to enhance alertness, vigilance, attention, and reaction time. The minimum effective dose differs across individuals, obviously, but at minimum, we can refer to that data to reference the benchmark of when wakefulness promoting effects set in that could be negatively impactful on sleep quality. If an average person with average capacity to metabolize caffeine waits 2 hours to take their average 200 milligram dose of caffeine within 5 hours, or I guess 7 hours after waking, they still have 100 milligrams in their system imparting effects. 12 hours after waking, they're at 50 milligrams. 17 hours after waking, they have 25 milligrams circulating. That is the rough pharmacokinetic elimination profile for somebody with average metabolism using a very mild 200 milligram dose per day. It's exceeding a residual amount that I would consider totally benign with absolute certainty from a potential sleep interference standpoint. So if somebody has a higher dose of caffeine, has a slow CYP1A2 gene, is older, or an array of other factors are present, they could have a much higher amount of caffeine circulating still by the time they need to go to sleep as well. A 2023 systematic review and meta-analysis investigated the effect of caffeine on the characteristics of nighttime sleep with the intent to identify the time after which caffeine should not be consumed prior to bedtime. A systematic search of the literature was undertaken with 24 studies included in the analysis. The review concluded that for someone with a 10 p.m. bedtime, to avoid reductions in total sleep time, coffee at a total daily dose of 107 milligrams should be consumed at least 8.8 hours prior to bedtime, and a standard serving of pre-workout at a total daily dose of 217.5 milligrams should be consumed at least 13.2 hours prior to bedtime. So the margin of error appears to be low, with literature suggesting that you might be able to get away with waiting 2 hours to take your daily caffeine hit but also strongly implying that the earlier you take your caffeine, the better to ensure no sleep interference. But ultimately, this is something you're gonna need to experiment with. It's just, I'm not convinced that waiting 90 to 120 minutes to take caffeine in the morning is superior. And I feel like it has probably more drawbacks than upside for most people. And this is just from like a practical interpretation standpoint as well, not factoring in the experience of having caffeine after waking up. Like I can't imagine clock watching every day until a couple hours has passed for me to get my coffee or energy drink that I love the taste and look forward to in the morning. It's just like a lot of drawbacks to it that I don't really see as a net benefit when you could otherwise just plan the pharmacokinetic profile of your daily caffeine ingestion a little bit more conducively to avoiding crashing, if that was even something that was happening because of when you timed the caffeine. Now the last ingredient in the formula, Huperzine A, 200 micrograms. Huperzine A is a natural compound found in the plant Huperzia serrata, has been used in traditional Chinese medicine for centuries. Cholinergic activity. It is most well known for its cholinergic activity, and it is because Huperzine A is a potent and selective inhibitor of acetylcholinesterase, an enzyme that breaks down the neurotransmitter acetylcholine in the brain. And by inhibiting acetylcholinesterase, Huperzine A increases the levels of acetylcholine in the brain indirectly, leading to enhanced cholinergic neurotransmission. This increased cholinergic activity has been shown to improve cognitive function, memory, and learning. In addition to its acetylcholinesterase inhibiting activity, Huperzine A has also shown neuroprotective effects. It has been shown to protect neurons from oxidative stress and to promote the growth and survival of neurons. Acetylcholine is not only a major regulator of cognitive performance, but as mentioned earlier in the video as well, it's also an important neurotransmitter needed for optimal muscular contractions during exercise. So getting into some of the studies, some of these are pretty wild. Effects of Huperzine A supplementation on memory and learning performance. A meta-analysis of placebo-controlled randomized trials assessed the effects of Huperzine A on patients with Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. 8 trials with 733 participants showed that Huperzine A significantly improved cognitive function measured by memory quotient in patients with Alzheimer's disease. A 4-week clinical trial was conducted to determine the efficacy of 100 micrograms of Huperzine A dosed twice per day on memory and learning performance in 34 pairs of junior middle school students complaining of memory inadequacy. At the end of the trial, the Huperzine A group's memory quotient was more than that of the placebo group, and Chinese language lesson scores in the Huperzine A group were elevated as well, suggesting enhanced memory and learning performance in Huperzine A treated adolescent students. The effects of Huperzine A supplementation on dopaminergic activity. Despite primarily acting as a cholinergic, some evidence suggests that Huperzine A may also influence the level of other neurotransmitters, including dopamine. A rodent model found that Huperzine A significantly increased the levels of dopamine and norepinephrine throughout the prefrontal cortex. Another rodent model found that Huperzine A had similar potency on increasing dopamine levels to the pharmaceutical acetylcholinesterase inhibitor donepezil. So there's another comparison to this very potent drug that is used in cognitively declining individuals for cholinergic activity specifically. We had the Alpha-GPC study earlier showing the comparison to donepezil. And then here, notably that was in humans though, this one is a rodent model, but still similar potency on increasing dopamine levels to the pharma drug donepezil, pretty wild. Now moving on to the effects of Huperzine A supplementation on participants infused with intravenous cocaine. Yes, you heard me correctly, intravenous cocaine and Huperzine A. Changes in the dopamine system due to drugs of abuse have been extensively studied. However, cholinergic transmission is also altered by drugs of abuse and contributes to psychostimulant reinforcement. For example, acetylcholinesterase inhibitors block cocaine self-administration in monkeys. This finding, among others in animal models, have led researchers to investigate the safety and preliminary efficacy of the acetylcholinesterase inhibitor Huperzine A as a treatment for cocaine use disorder. Wild, wild. In a 2015 double-blind randomized placebo-controlled study, participants were randomly chosen to receive Huperzine A or placebo. Participants received randomized infusions of cocaine, 0 and 40 milligrams intravenous on days 1 and 9. On day 10, participants received non-contingent randomized infusions of cocaine, 0 and 20 milligrams intravenous, before being given 5 opportunities at 15-minute intervals to purchase additional infusions or to keep $5 for each choice opportunity. Time course and peak effects analyses showed that treatment with 400 micrograms of Huperzine A significantly attenuated cocaine-induced increases of bad effects and willing to pay, i.e., how much are you willing to pay for the cocaine infusion you just received in dollars. So pretty cool to see. Kind of wild study of people being infused with cocaine and then seeing the Huperzine A dopaminergic interplay there. And earlier, also seeing it with Alpha-GPC and how these cholinergic compounds are not just, essentially useful for, brain choline content or lifting in the gym. There's also other interplay with motivation levels and drive and other kind of satellite interactions that were not once considered with that much depth, are becoming more well understood and starting to be researched, which is pretty wild and cool to see. So that is the Gorilla Mode 2.0 formula. Now we should get into ingredients I didn't include in the formula and why, because I'm sure there are, some of you guys who are nerds like me might be thinking, oh, well, what about this? Why didn't this make it? This ingredient's great. That should have been in there. Let me just get into proactively what I assume might be one of the ingredients you would say that about, but maybe not also, but I'm just going to give my justification for what my thought process was around many ingredients that are commonly used in pre-workouts nowadays and why they didn't make it in. First off, we have the classic paresthesia, butthole itch inducing beta-alanine. You're probably like, what are you doing? Holding up a tub. This is beta-alanine by Gorilla Mind, shockingly. Why do we have this ingredient if we hate it so much? I'll explain. So beta-alanine is the ingredient that makes your skin itchy and has you sitting there scratching your face between sets. Lovely ingredient. It is typically included in pre-workouts under the guise of, a muscular endurance enhancer. But the reality is that most pre-workouts have it simply because you can blatantly feel something when you take it. So people associate feeling something with the product being potent. People will literally attest to the fact that they like feeling the itch kick in. Personally, I can't stand the paresthesia effect that beta-alanine induces, and it can be bad enough that I think it ruins a pre-workout just based on that alone. If the benefits of beta-alanine were immediate and didn't require a massive reservoir of downstream carnosine stores to reach significance, I might be more willing to accept the, crackhead level face itching that comes with it. However, when used acutely in a pre-workout, it has negligible effects on endurance performance and near zero effect on the type of weightlifting most of us use pre-workouts for, which is sessions 1 to 1.5 hours, 12 reps per set, kind of stuff, hypertrophy work. A lot of us are not getting any real significant impact acutely from beta-alanine in the context in which we use it. We're getting itches, essentially. So beta-alanine is a building block of carnosine, a molecule that helps buffer intracellular acidity by binding to hydrogen ions, allowing for a longer duration of exercise at a higher intensity. So beta-alanine supplementation improves performance during high intensity exercise, but it has to be over a minute for it to actually start to show its effects. So between 1 and 10 minutes. If you were to take it correctly, dosing it multiple times per day for weeks on end at a high enough dose, the impact on performance is notable for muscular endurance specifically. So the median effect of beta-alanine supplementation is a 2.85% improvement in the outcome of an exercise measure when a median total of 179 grams of beta-alanine is supplemented. So 179 grams, which notably is an amount no one is going to be ingesting in a pre-workout, obviously, for a 2.85% improvement in performance and a ton of itchiness. And I'm talking about itchiness at the single digit gram range. Really low dosages make you feel like a fucking crackhead with this stuff. The conclusion from these studies: although some laboratory field-based studies show an ergogenic effect with beta-alanine supplementation, there is a lack of field-based research in training and competition settings. There was an unclear effect of beta-alanine on competition performance when compared to placebo, with no meaningful changes in blood chemistry. While there was a transient improvement on training performance after 4 weeks of beta-alanine, there was an unclear effect at 10 weeks and no meaningful changes in blood chemistry. Beta-alanine supplementation appears to have minimal effect on swimming performance in non-laboratory controlled real-world training and competition settings. So, what happens if you want to actually get the benefits of this stuff? How do you use it? You would need to buy it separately. Anyways, even if it was in your pre-workout. And with clear intent, you would have to make sure you are taking 3.2 to 6.4 grams of this stuff per day for weeks on end. And to avoid annoying paresthesia, you may need to split that dose up into 0.8 to 1.6 gram increments of beta-alanine every 3 to 4 hours. So imagine trying to remember to take this every 3 to 4 hours. It would fucking suck. In addition, beta-alanine requires eating up to 6.4 grams of valuable serving size space to get an effective dose in a pre-workout. So keep in mind, when you have scoop sizes about 20 plus grams per 2 scoops, 40 plus, 6.4 grams of that space needs to be eaten up by beta-alanine to get even the effect that could hypothetically accumulate if you actually took your pre-workout every single day. And this is not apples to apples with creatine and, taking your creatine every day, because there's actual utility to that for the workout, potential increased assimilation of it peri-workout, but more importantly, this is an ingredient that does not fuck up your workout with paresthesia. It's something that you would be taking anyways, separately for hypertrophy and actual lifting performance in the context in which most of us take pre-workout. So again, I'm not saying beta-alanine does not work or it's not useful, but in general, if we're looking for muscular strength, power with short bouts of exercise or short high intensity activity with heavy lifts, that's creatine is, everyone's gonna be on creatine and it's not gonna annoy the shit out of you with crackhead itches. Whereas beta-alanine will make you itchy and will not provide acute benefits really in the capacity of which we're deploying it. And then to actually get the benefits you want to get out of it, you have to take it separately and you have to deal with paresthesia a lot. So I think it's a great ingredient, as paradoxical as that sounds to contradictory to what I just said, but it's for certain sports and exercise regimens that involve high intensity exercise lasting several minutes straight. I don't think it's an ROI positive pre-workout ingredient when, like I said, 6.4 grams, I could use nootropics or more actual pump inducing ingredients or hyperhydrating ingredients or things that are going to move the needle in a vector that I think is worth leaning into rather than something that makes me itchy. That's ultimately what I'm getting out of the beta-alanine acutely pre-workout. So like I said, I don't think it's the paresthesia is ultimately the only reliable effect you can expect from an acutely, and it's hit or miss as to how many people want to be forced to endure that when they take their pre-workout. So, to appease all the people that like itching their face off from the beta-alanine and feeling it kick in and stuff, I think there's just as many people, if not way more, that don't want that and want the ability to flexibly make that part of the pre-workout when they feel like it versus not. So that's why we sell it separately. I think that makes the most sense to not only encourage proper dosing and adherence, because you're probably not going to get any noticeable buildup of carnosine stores via taking it in a pre-workout a few times a week. This makes you take it properly. In addition, you can choose if you have paresthesia pre-workout or not. So not to force everyone that has our product to have to be scratching their balls mid-set and the bottom of their feet and their goddamn buttholes and their faces. You can choose if you get that now. So GorillaMind.com/product/beta-alanine. You can add this to your cart for fairly cheap, and then you can literally choose when you want to get those acute effects. And when I say acute effects, I mean acute itching effects, or build up to the actual muscular endurance enhancing capacity of it via the daily usage of the max, 3.2 to 6.4 gram dose. Next up, estrogen. I mentioned it briefly earlier when talking about bioperine, but it's time to dissect this one specifically. So estrogen is a proprietary blend of astragalus and Panax nodo ginseng designed to enhance the absorption of nutrients in the gastrointestinal tract. So I'm familiar with astragalus. I've been interested in it for a while for kidney health and its potential impact on telomere length. And we sell it on GorillaMind.com as well. However, its supposed utility in enhancing the bioavailability of select amino acids in conjunction with Panax nodo ginseng at such a small dose has always been very confusing for me, because it is featured in dosages of like 25 to 50 milligrams, despite the efficacious dose of astragalus root extract for basically any application, especially boosting EGFR levels, being in the thousands of milligrams range. Like I've personally seen astragalus root extract clearly improve biomarkers, but it requires grams per day to achieve those changes. And even if it did enhance the uptake of, an otherwise already bioavailable ingredient similar to the bioperine, would it not just be more reliable to use a maxed out proven efficacious dose of that amino acid instead, rather than relying on estrogen to hopefully make it work better at a shittier dose? Like, to me, this seems more reliable rather than using a lower sub-maximal dose and then adding a bioavailability enhancer on top of it in hopes of it enhancing its effects to a level that you could otherwise guarantee by just using the max efficacious dose to begin with. So that's how we're coming at it with Gorilla Mode. Like 10 grams of citrulline, betaine, 4 grams, like creatine monohydrate, 5 grams, like what am I enhancing with estrogen? Like, please explain. I don't get what the point is. So, like, I could see the potential utility if space is a concern. So, like, let's just say you have a capsule product and you have some sort of amino acid that you're trying to enhance the nitric oxide production capacity of it or something. I would sort of get it if it actually worked. However, even like in that capacity, I'm skeptical of this ingredient. It's why I asked the late Dr. Hector Lopez for his opinion on it. If you don't know Dr. Lopez, he was a prolific researcher and formulator in this industry who unfortunately passed away, and I had a lot of respect for. Incredibly nice guy. He brought in an immense amount of value to the industry. Huge loss. Overall, his opinion was that the literature supporting estrogen was dependent on loose mechanistic hypothetical claims from preclinical animal and in vitro data using doses magnitudes higher than those used in humans in dietary supplements to yield any enhanced amino acid uptake metrics, and is likely not worth using. If you can see in vitro that a pathway is upregulated after the administration of an ingredient, and that same mechanistic pathway is involved in amino acid uptake, concluding that the ingredient is then definitively going to significantly increase amino acid uptake in humans is a huge stretch. And I would tend to agree. He went into a lot more detail, and ultimately it was enough to convince me that it would be likely more reliable to just dose bioavailable already ingredients where I'd want to see them as a consumer, rather than rely on speculative amino acid uptake enhancing adjunct ingredients that probably don't work. He did add a caveat that estrogen is being studied in humans right now in China using a 50 milligram dose to evaluate its effect on L-Arginine absorption and NO production. He mentioned that to me a couple of years ago, and I checked, and it appears that the results of that study have come out, and nearly 90% of outcomes measured came back insignificant. So overall, I strongly suspect that this ingredient probably does almost nothing, and for the time being, unless I learn more, I'd prefer to just rely on using the actual max dose of the ingredient, of the dosages of the actives I want to get the effect out of, rather than using a weaker dose and then justifying that weaker dose with something like estrogen on top. Like in a powder, a stacked powder, like what am I accomplishing, If I had like a 2 capsule serving size and I'm trying to max out some sort of vasodilation potential of some like tiny dose of something, I could see the utility, but even then, I am skeptical that this stuff does anything. Moving on to the next ingredient, Synactive. This is a very popular one, or at least it seemingly is. Senescent cells are cells that have permanently stopped dividing but do not undergo cell death. They are in a state of permanent growth arrest but remain metabolically active, often secreting inflammatory cytokines, growth factors, and proteases. Senescent cells accumulate with age and contribute to the aging process by promoting inflammation and tissue dysfunction. Their presence is associated with age-related conditions such as arthritis, cardiovascular disease, and neurodegenerative diseases. Senolytics are drugs or compounds that can selectively induce death of these senescent cells and potentially reducing, as a result of that, age-related tissue damage and improving overall health span. SantEnergy is a branded compound, or I should say blend, proprietary blend, that is marketed as one of these senolytics, primarily for athletic performance. It's a prop blend of 2 plant extracts, Panax notoginseng and Rosa Roxburghi. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of that, but these extracts are selected for their purported ability to enhance muscle energy and promote recovery indirectly via their capacity to clear senescent cells. So, at a first glance, the dosage and composition looked really familiar. And then I realized this is made by the same company who makes estrogen, and half the composition is the exact same. They just swapped astragalus with Rosa Roxburghi. As of now, the discussion of senolytics revolves around some key pharmaceutical drug candidates, probably the most notable being dasatinib, it's a hard one to say, dasatinib, and some particular over-the-counter supplements as well, like quercetin and fisetin or fisetin. I have yet to see any non-SantEnergy manufacturer funded clinical studies evaluating SantEnergy as a senolytic, or even mentioning its existence as a viable one. Broadly speaking, the category of senolytics for human use still has a question mark for actual impact on longevity, and even more so for body composition effects. Even if it did work, and even if SantEnergy was an effective senolytic, the inclusion of it is also questionable in a pre-workout. Like, this is not something I'd want somebody to be forced to take in a pre-workout. Personally, if I'm going to take a senolytic, I want to be able to cycle it in and out of my daily regimen with more control. To date, intermittent therapy appears to be the best approach to reducing senescent cells, because drugs that express or reduce the expression of pro-inflammatory compounds secreted by senescent cells seem to be more effective when taken on an intermittent basis. And based on the available preclinical research, once weekly ingestion of high doses of fisetin, quercetin, theaflavins, and apigenin appear to be an optimal senolytic approach if it was a viable category to begin with. So basically, if I were to use a senolytic, I'd probably opt for one of the actual heavy hitters that has at least somewhat been rigorously evaluated against the other most promising candidates. And I wouldn't be using it in a pre-workout where it's forcing me to take it pre-workout. I would be using it sporadically, intermittently, as per, what's working best in the most recent clinical literature. Moving on to the next ingredient that we did not include, taurine. So while taurine is a useful antioxidant and has some literature supporting its utility for enhancing endurance, exercise performance, taurine acts as a agonist at the glycine and GABA receptors and is a nervous system depressant. Expectedly, its inclusion in stimulant-based energy-enhancing formulas like energy drinks and pre-workouts has led to some confusion among scholars and researchers who see it as a sedative more than as like a complementary stimulant ingredient. I would sort of understand the inclusion in pre-workout. It makes more sense, but I think taurine picked up most of its steam initially from being megadosed in like Red Bull or Monster. I forget which energy drink has the high dose that first included it, but like I speculate initially it got a lot of hype being in energy drinks and then was assumed to be an energy enhancing ingredient. But the reality is its inclusion in energy drinks, the inclusion of it in energy drinks was mainly to make loose sports performance enhancing claims potentially, but I think more likely to dull the stimulating effects of caffeine so users will drink more. That's my assumption. Acting as a nervous system depressant, this is not something that is going to augment, the stimulatory capacity of a drink. Rather, it is going to make it a little more subtle, but then give you a higher threshold of energy drink consumption potential, likely. That's what I'd think, though. I could be totally wrong, but like the inclusion of taurine would be counterproductive for sure to at least the distinct cognitive energy boosting effects that we're trying to provide with our stimulant based products, and Gorilla Mode is no exception to that. With that said though, the net effect of taurine on sports performance via the enhanced endurance exercise capacity, it's probably a net positive for actual sports performance. But so it's like, why didn't we include it? Ran out of room. I think it's a good ingredient ultimately. But if we wanted to include it, we would have had to make this a protein drug. So We could not do that. We couldn't make this a literal protein powder scoop and jug. We didn't include it. However, we will be adding it to Nitric. Spoiler alert, if you made it this far in the video, Nitric will soon have taurine in it as well at 3 grams. And in a stimulant-free formula meant for pure pump, performance, hydration, that's where taurine would shine the most, in my opinion. And then you could hypothetically combine Nitric and Mode for the best of both worlds. That's what a lot of people will be doing anyways, to get their preferred amount of hyperhydration, vasodilation potential, but then also like modulate their stim and nootropic accordingly. Or for those just sticking with Mode on its own, you can be assured that the stimulant and nootropic blend will not be blunted by nervous system depressants. So hopefully that's seen as an upside more than like a detriment to the product. So, you know, I would like to include it, but I mean, at the end of the day, it might be a blessing in disguise that we literally can't fit it in this one, because I would hate to see the tyrosine, the cholinergics, the caffeine, all of it be blunted to some extent just so I could have included like an endurance enhancing ingredient that is helpful. But I mean, ultimately, people want to feel this thing hit. So I don't want to blunt that whatsoever. So I think putting in Nitric is probably the move anyways. Next up, theobromine. This is a stimulant I see added as complementary to caffeine, is what it is marketed as. Theobromine is a product of human metabolism of caffeine, which is metabolized in the liver into 12% theobromine, 4% theophylline, and 84% paraxanthine. It is also the primary alkaloid found in cocoa and chocolate. It is often included in pre-workouts as a complementary stimulant. However, I don't believe it's complementary at all. Theobromine competes with caffeine for adenosine receptor antagonism. Theobromine is also weaker than caffeine in both its inhibition of cyclic nucleotide phosphodiesterases and its antagonism of adenosine receptors themselves. In addition, the pharmacokinetic profile is dragged out way more. It has a peak time of 2 to 3 hours as a consequence of its lack of water solubility, whereas caffeine peaks within only 30 minutes. Has a longer half-life, 6 to 8 hours, whereas caffeine is only 5 hours. Like the ideal adenosine receptor antagonist would work potently, quickly, and feature a pharmacokinetic profile that supports maximal clearance or as close to it as possible by the end of your day, allowing adenosine to do its job when you're actually trying to fall asleep, but giving the stimulatory input you need when you're actually dosing it and getting it in and out acutely, hitting hard, and then getting the hell out of your system. Overall, my current perspective on theobromine is that it is a counterintuitive ingredient to include in a formula, a pre-workout formula, as it could literally inhibit caffeine from working as well via adenosine receptor competition. So it could make it more difficult to get higher quality sleep because of its inferior pharmacokinetic profile. It's competing for the literal receptors that caffeine needs to interact with to work properly, and you're probably impeding the pharmacokinetic profile of the caffeine itself by having overlapping ingredients that also metabolize via similar pathways. So in general, you're basically making caffeine not work to the extent that it could, or you are introducing a shitty stimulant basically that takes way too long to work its way out of your system, when you could have just modulated your caffeine accordingly. If you need more stimulation, wouldn't it make more sense to just increase the dose of caffeine slightly and then know it's still going to work its way out of your system in time to go to bed because of its superior half-life, pharmacokinetic profile versus the theobromine, which is dragged out peak time, longer half-life, competes for the same receptors, interacts with the same metabolic pathways. It's just like, why are we using this? It's like the shitty caffeine, ugly stepchild or whatever you want to call it. Like, I don't know. It is just not a good ingredient in my opinion. So it wasn't even a debate or a consideration if we would use theobromine. It's just like not useful if you're going to be relying primarily on caffeine as the stimulant driver of a pre-workout, in my opinion. And that brings us to our next 3 compounds. Infinity, also known as paraxanthine, is the actual compound. Teacrine, compound name thecrine, and dynamine, compound name methylliberine. So adjacent to theobromine, or bromine, I figured it would be, the ideal time to transition to quick mentions about Infinity, teacrine, dynamine. They're included for similar reasons. Basically, Now, paraxanthine is marketed as like caffeine without the side effects. Theacrine is marketed as a subtle and smooth energy booster that you don't build tolerance to or will get withdrawals from. Methylcobalamin is marketed as a slightly more aggressive iteration of theacrine. They're all used as like these complementary energy boosting or cognitively lifting ingredients. As mentioned when discussing theobromine, during metabolism of caffeine, 84% of the metabolic yield is paraxanthine. And guess how it acts and works? Via adenosine receptor antagonism, just like theobromine, and would compete with caffeine for binding with concurrent use. So paraxanthine actually has a similar binding affinity to caffeine itself, and some literature suggests it may even have higher binding affinity, so it would be a even more efficient adenosine receptor antagonist than theobromine, and would inhibit the action of caffeine more significantly milligram for milligram than theobromine would. Notable for that ingredient, theacrine has a reported half-life as low as 16.5 hours and as high as 33 hours. So 16.5 to 33 hour half-life. Methylcobalamin has a short half-life of only 1.5 hours, but an interaction study showed concomitant administration of both caffeine and methylcobalamin increases the half-life of caffeine by about twofold. And this is likely due to inhibition of the CYP1A2 enzyme. So first of all, just overarchingly with all three of these pharmacokinetic profiles are pretty fucking bad, at least in my opinion. So like a compound with a 30-hour half-life being used as an energy booster is just insane to begin with. Methylcobalamin, even if it was a solid compound, via its significant inhibition of caffeine metabolism, you're basically killing its viability in a pre-workout entirely, because we know how far out you need to be cutting off your pre-workout consumption to not impede sleep quality. And in addition, all three of these compounds are extremely expensive. So you would hope at least one of them would feel incredible to make including any of them make sense. But the reality is that all three of these compounds feel weaker than caffeine and are not really strong candidates to act as the primary adenosine receptor antagonists that we rely on for the heaviest acute hit of energy in a pre-workout. So like ranking strongest to weakest, not even factoring in, with the depth and rigor of scientific data, clinical studies reinforcing the efficacy and safety profiles of each, because caffeine decimates the rest already instantly. In descending order just on like potency and feel, the tiers list would look like caffeine, paraxanthine, methylcobalamin, theacrine. These caffeine adjacent type compounds are very expensive. They either have poor elimination profiles inherently, like theacrine, horrid, or they ruin the pharmacokinetic control you have over caffeine metabolism, like methylcobalamin. Like if you combine all three of them at their clinical dosages, they would still feel weaker than just basic cheap caffeine. So if you want a smoother effect from caffeine, like there's a smarter way to go about it, which is use a lower dose, or you could stack something like L-theanine on top, at that point, or taurine or whatever. Like these tangential, expensive, and often counterproductive caffeine adjacent compounds that interact with the same receptor to mediate their effects, like I don't see as good candidates for inclusion in a pre-workout. I'm not sure why they're so sought after or hyped when, find me a compound that doesn't interact primarily through the adenosine receptor, and then we're talking about something that's worth even talking about. But these are, just like modulate your caffeine better. You plan the dosage, the implementation of it. If you want to drag out the effect, then you could hypothetically use an extended release. But I mean, like, caffeine is the fucking shit, dude, for a reason. And this, again, all of this was not even factoring in like the rigor of the scientific data. Like these are relatively new developed ingredients in terms of like they've existed for a long time, but they haven't had much attention around them or rigor into, the best dose for implementing for performance enhancement in X area or Y area or Z area. It's just basically been like shitty studies on subjective effects not compared to caffeine, and then hyping it up as superior because it feels smoother or whatever. It's like, that is not the benchmark for what we're trying to strive for with like a high quality stimulant that's going to replace caffeine or complement it. And that brings us into our next ingredient that we didn't include, SantEnergy Nu. This is a trademarked ingredient marketed as a polyphenol-rich, high quality plant extract from Santa Herba. And I use quotes because they literally say in the marketing material, a polyphenol rich high quality plant extract from Santa Herba. They claim that their clinical results show a significant weight and body fat loss while nutrition and exercise habits remain the same as prior to the trial. Mechanistically, it purportedly increases metabolic rate by preventing the formation of glycation end products, and also has an energizing caffeine-like stimulating effect on the body and strong antioxidant property, both known to be beneficial for weight loss. The proposed mechanisms, such as enhanced thermogenesis and antioxidant activity, are plausible and supported by the general understanding of polyphenols' effects on metabolism, cellular health, but the extent to which these mechanisms translate into noticeable effects for weight management and energy levels in humans is not established, and there's limited independent research on this ingredient. Most claims about its benefits come from studies on yerba santa or related polyphenols, not even the actual trademarked ingredient SantEnergy Nu. This ingredient already doesn't appear to me as a pre-workout conducive ingredient at a glance, but when you actually dig into the literature, it's less than impressive, because this would be seen as like a complementary stimulant or energy boosting ingredient, you would think. But the nail in the coffin was this paper that they showcase as like the only paper essentially that they use to market their ingredient, describing how it works. And it reveals that it yields energizing effects via its dose-dependent binding to the adenosine receptor A2A. If that receptor sounds familiar, it's because caffeine exerts many of its energizing effects via adenosine receptor A2A inhibition. So again, one of these fucking things. To investigate whether Santa Herba extract can exert caffeine-like energizing effects in a model organism, worm motility and locomotion rates were documented after caffeine and Santa Herba extract treatment. So yes, their experiment to exhibit the energy-enhancing characteristics of their trademarked ingredient is to give Santa Herba extract, which may not even be their branded ingredient, to worms, and comparing that to the effects of caffeine-dosed worms. Now, guess what the results were. So 1,000 micrograms per milliliter of Santa Herba significantly stimulated worm motility rate in comparison to control. 7.47% went up, as determined by increased number of body bends. And the number of body bends in the worms was similar to the amount induced by 100 micrograms per milliliter of caffeine, which increased 7.33%. So my takeaway is, like, even if this worked in humans and not worms, it took 10 times the fucking dose of Santa Herba extract to induce the same motility rate change as 1/10 the dose of Santa Herba through caffeine in the worms. So you're basically advertising as the primary takeaway for why this is useful is worms were exposed to 10 times the dose to get the same effect. You know, am I supposed to be impressed here? Like, I don't fucking get it, dude. Given that they both facilitate their energy enhancing effects primarily through adenosine receptor antagonism, like, to me, like, formulating products, I don't really understand the sense in using, I don't know the price, but I'm assuming it's expensive, being a branded ingredient. Also poorly researched, objectively weak, experimental blend of high quality plant extract instead of caffeine. Because again, like, if I need more adenosine receptor inhibition antagonism, I will just add a bit more caffeine, not this. Like, why would I choose this? I just don't understand. So anyway, that ingredient was like almost insulting, because it's like, here's a fucking worm study using a 10x dose to achieve the same outcome. Maybe. Go buy it now and ingest it. Like, no, fuck off. And that brings us to the next ingredient, Zinamide. So Zinamide is a trademarked Magnifera indica mango leaf extract standardized to contain greater than 60% magniferin. It is often marketed as a caffeine alternative slash replacement by the company that makes it. No literature exists I'm aware of that compares Zinamide to caffeine, so I think it's safe to say that that claim is already too subjective and biased to really take seriously from the company marketing it. Like, with that kind of claim, you should be putting out studies, pitting them head to head, I think. But I suspect a study like that would reveal what we all suspect, which is that caffeine would probably smoke it. But with that said, could it be a viable secondary adjunct energy boosting or cognitive enhancing compound? But at a first glance, at least mechanistically, it appears so. It doesn't work via adenosine receptor antagonism or phosphodiesterase inhibition, which is promising. Rather, magniferin inhibits the catechol-O-methyltransferase COMT enzyme that breaks down dopamine in the prefrontal cortex, which could theoretically increase the concentration of retained dopamine. So like finally an ingredient that does something else other than just like acts as shitty caffeine. Anecdotally, Dynamite has been reported to feel weak or unnoticeable. Clinically, pharmaceutical COMT inhibitors are typically used in Parkinson's disease treatment to prolong the effect of the Parkinson's medication levodopa. When used as monotherapy though, COMT inhibitors clinically have shown to have no effect on dopamine levels in the brain, but they do increase brain L-dopa levels when combined with levodopa and benzerazide, a peripherally active dopa D-carboxylase inhibitor. So as may be the case with Dynamite, there may be compensatory activation of the monoamine oxidase MAO dopamine metabolizing pathway. When COMT is inhibited, this goes up in order to, pick up the slack and still gets rid of dopamine just the same. That would just be my speculation. It's either a weak COMT inhibitor or there's compensatory activity going on, or I don't know. I don't know how powerful it actually is because I don't have enough anecdote or data to refer to see how strong is the dopaminergic activity or indirect activity via its COMT inhibition. I would have to look into it more. So I wouldn't write off this ingredient entirely. I may revisit it in the future, but at least at the time, skimming this stuff, I didn't feel it was promising enough to really dig into when I was formulating mode. So maybe I'll try it more in the future, but that is just kind of at least mechanistically, it's interesting. But when I looked at the clinical applications of these kind of inhibitors, it didn't seem overly helpful. So it kind of turned me off. Ultimately, with some of the stuff though, you do have to just kind of try it. Everyone responds differently. So if there's at least a safety profile that kind of makes it, kind of justifies the experimentation to where you feel like there's a sufficient amount of data that would lead you to believe it's safe to try a sample of, it could be worthwhile to try something like a Dynamite to see if it has an additive effect for you. Because ultimately, sometimes anecdote is going to be, for some of these more novel ingredients, kind of necessary, especially for your individual, chemistry to see how you respond. So, take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt too, but this is just my interpretation of a lot of the data, the fucking SantEnergy Nu thing, was never gonna make it into a formula of mine personally, based on that. But some of these more kind of promising, probably bullshit, but maybe not actually. Some people seem to like it. Seems to be impactful for some people. Try them. See how you feel, and maybe they could be impactful for you. Maybe I may revisit the Dynamite one, so we'll see. Anyway, moving on to extended release caffeine. So this is becoming more popular in the past few years. Extended release formats of caffeine are often added alongside fast-acting regular caffeine anhydrous to provide a more sustained release of stimulatory effect over an extended period of time, rather than having the immediate spike and then subsequent drop associated with regular caffeine consumption. The most popular forms of extended release caffeine available we commonly see in pre-workouts now are probably dicaffeine malate and patented Zoom XR. So dicaffeine malate, let's cover that first, is a combination of approximately 75% caffeine and 25% malic acid. It's often marketed as extended release caffeine. However, I am not actually aware of a pharmacokinetic profile assessment that has shown it to be any different than regular caffeine. With exception of it being proportionally less active caffeine per gram of powder, I don't really know if it actually does have this extended release effect. So with ingredients like citrulline malate, there's often clear intent to inflate the perceived potency of a product. But with dicaffeine malate, typically the intent is either to imply, complementary extended release properties, or alternatively, to not exceed the 400 milligram compliance threshold of any specific type of caffeine on the label. There's I don't actually know if it has an extended release profile at the end of the day. It may not. It may just be like 75% yield caffeine with 25% malic acid added with it. So, however, Zoom XR is different in that it features caffeine encapsulated microbeads. So these microbeads are designed to dissolve slowly in the digestive system, allowing caffeine to be gradually released over time. They have an extended release version and a delayed release version. Zoom XR extended release delivers not more than 55% of total caffeine at 1 hour after ingestion and not less than 80% at 6 hours, whereas their delayed release caffeine delivers not more than 25% at 1 hour and over 80% at 2 hours. So while I think this has utility for, genetically predisposed fast metabolizers of caffeine, the majority of us can't even take a potent pre-workout with regular caffeine anhydrous within 13.2 hours of bedtime without it impairing sleep quality to some degree. Even if relatively insignificant, like that is something we do have to consider even with regular caffeine. So, like as mentioned earlier, caffeine anhydrous has a half-life of 3 to 7 hours with an average half-life of 5 hours for the average person. To think that our massive hit of stims in the pre-workout we took 15 to 30 minutes ago is going to cause a crash mid-workout or even post-workout, like 1 to 1.5 hours after ingestion of like 400 milligrams of caffeine or 200 or whatever, and that I need an extended release caffeine to combat this, like to me, that doesn't seem logical. In addition to even know what dose of caffeine yield is leading to performance enhancement in the gym, we use anhydrous as the benchmark. Like in all the studies, we cross-reference the literature, and we know what the dosages are using regular old caffeine anhydrous. But these extended release formats, they contain less caffeine per gram than regular caffeine anhydrous. And if we delay the acute effect of caffeine, we are going to get less overall benefit out of the ingredient too, as it's meant to peak for your lifts, not peak, hours later after the workout. So, if the dose used of caffeine anhydrous is too high and causes issues, rather than choosing, sustained release format, I would just lower the dose of anhydrous personally. You can redose it later if you want to bleed out the effect more, avoid a crash or whatever. Like I can see the utility of extended release caffeine in very specific circumstances for the right genetic predisposition. Like for example, like a fast metabolizer who needs a constant flow of smooth energy throughout their workday and also doesn't want to have to think about redosing caffeine anhydrous multiple times or whatever. Like I do think it has utility in that context for that kind of person. But in a pre-workout, when I'm trying to get like the full yield effect of the caffeine to like smash at the right time in my workout to maximize the force production I'm getting or the acute drive and motivation and stress resilience component that I'm getting, like I know how to time that all based on the literature provided on anhydrous and how the drug metabolizes. I don't really know how to do that with the extended release or what the utility would be, other than like avoiding a crash that you would theoretically only be getting if you maybe planned your caffeine anhydrous intake poorly or less than ideally. So I think the extended release has utility though for like a work day or like a non-workout kind of thing. But in a pre-workout, I think caffeine anhydrous is kind of like the gold standard. L-Theanine, next ingredient. So this was discovered as a constituent of green tea in 1949, and in 1950 it was isolated from gyokuro leaves. The main benefits of L-theanine are associated with promoting a relaxed state without causing drowsiness or sedation. After consumption, it can cross the blood-brain barrier and provide promotes an increase in alpha waves, and this increase in alpha waves may be responsible for the stress reduction and anxiety reduction properties of L-theanine. It's structurally similar to the excitatory neurotransmitter glutamate, and it binds to glutamate receptors, acting as an antagonist at the AMPA and kainate receptors, and acts as a partial co-agonist of the NMDA receptors. Partial NMDA agonists bind to and activate the NMDA receptor, but only have partial efficacy at the receptor relative to a full agonist. And theanine also blocks the reuptake of glutamine and glutamate via the inhibition of glutamine transporters and glutamate transporters, increases dopamine, glycine, BDNF, as well as NGF levels in various areas of the brain, which is cool. May increase serotonin levels as well, but that is less certain because of conflicting literature. So ultimately, people are using L-theanine to smooth out jitters, though, alongside caffeine in general, as well as other stimulants. Outside of the gym, it has utility, and I like the ingredients. Yeah, we even include it in our energy drinks, nootropic formulas, but like, it's a calming ingredient. I don't think it adds value to a stimulant-dense pre-workout. So personally, again, if I'm trying to time the acute hit of caffeine and stimulants and nootropics, cholinergics, etc., to like maximally peak and maximize force production outcomes in the gym, stress resilience, energy output, it all needs to be condensed in like this 1 to 1.5 hour time frame. Like, I'm not using something to smooth out stuff. So I don't think it has a lot of utility for the same reasons why I removed Kana from the formula. I don't know if it's Kana or Kana, but that was why one of the main reasons we removed it from the formula is we suspected it was blunting the stimulants to some extent. So, you know, theanine, I think it's helpful like when you need it and when it makes sense to kind of like smooth things out, or even to help you get to sleep after caffeine ingestion earlier in the day. But like in the pre-workout itself, I don't think it makes that much sense. Moving on to Yohimbine and Rauwolscine. These are two well-known stimulants, alpha-2 adrenergic receptor antagonists. Rauwolscine is arguably more effective and a superior overall compound. It is why we actually have it on our website separately as a single ingredient and not Yohimbine. It's better for fat loss, which is the primary utility in my opinion, and it's just a cleaner feeling stimulant if you're going to use it as like a adrenaline booster to augment the stimulant blend in a pre-workout. It feels cleaner than Yohimbine. Yohimbine, it feels like you're going hypoglycemic when you use it, and Rauwolscine somewhat similarly does, but not to the same degree. Yohimbine feels like you're literally breaking out in cold sweats. You know, all of a sudden you're hypoglycemic, crashing, and you might even interpret that you are hypoglycemic. Go start slamming sugar and whatnot, but you know, it's just kind of like the dirtiest of dirty stimulants that doesn't even work that amazingly. Whereas Rauwolscine, you get the spike in adrenaline. It doesn't feel as dirty as Yohimbine. It definitely doesn't feel clean and euphoric like a DMHA or something. But it's better than Yohimbine, and it seems to burn more fat. They both work similarly through the alpha-2 adrenergic receptor as antagonists, and they induce like a fight or flight type feeling. And it is primarily driving that epinephrine, norepinephrine, cascade. So in general, it's kind of like if you want that drive your head through the wall type energy that like an aggressive stim junkie type product would give you, that's what you're getting out of this. So in a pre-workout, it's definitely like a plus at the right dose for a stim junkie, or it could totally ruin a pre-workout for others too. It's a very sensitive ingredient. Like in the right pre-workout, stim junkie pre-workout typically, for the right demographic, at the right dosage, like even 1 milligram too much of this stuff can wreck a pre-workout. It can be a good ingredient, but in general, I believe it is most ideally used separately and can be added manually if more adrenergic signaling is required. So for those of you who want to bump gorilla mode into like stim junkie territory, if you don't think this is intense enough, throw in one of these on top and I promise you'll be fucking crashing your head through the wall. Gorilla mode is already stacked. Pushing the adrenergic vector harder, I think is too big of a risk, considering it would probably only make the pre-workout like better from a stimulant perspective for like 1% of people, and then it would make it worse for everyone else. So that's why this is separate. You can get it separately. It's also in our fat burning formula that's stimulant based purposefully because it's a great fat burner primarily, I think. But I'll get into that in a sec as we talk about bitter orange, synephrine. So similarly to Rauwolscine, this is an ingredient that works well, but the type of stimulation it provides is not like the cleanest per se. So synephrine has been shown to behave as a partial agonist at alpha-1A adrenergic receptors, but as an antagonist at alpha-2A and alpha-2C adrenergic receptor subtypes. It can feel a bit dirty, and I feel it's better reserved for inclusion in fat burners where it excels most mechanistically. And this is why we also have, like in our AM fat burner, not the PM adjunct stim-free fat burner. They're denoted by like AM and PM. So like in the daytime has the stimulants, PM stim-free. We have synephrine in here as well as Rauwolscine. So you get the heavy hit of like the lipolysis-inducing adrenergic type stimulants in here. Some people might even like this as a pre-workout, by the way. So if you want to check it out, Citrulline AM is on the website right now. You can check that out. But in general, you know, synephrine, Yohimbine, Rauwolscine, as a fat burner, in a fat burner, great. In a pre-workout, I think it's a little bit too risky. That's why you would get it separately and then modulate accordingly manually. Moving into S7. This is a blend of coffee bean extract, green coffee bean extract, green tea extract, turmeric extract, tart cherry, blueberry, broccoli, and kale. And it's gotten some hype. It's basically a combination of natural antioxidants and anti-inflammatories. The mechanism by which it works and could hypothetically increase nitric oxide levels is, you know, theoretically sound given the known roles of antioxidants and plant extracts in supporting cardiovascular health. Turmeric is one of the most potent anti-inflammatory spices known to man, which is why it shows such therapeutic promise via supplementation as well. But this is something I go out of my way to avoid in a pre-workout, is like potent anti-inflammatory compounds. I don't want to dull the hormetic response to training. You know, anything part of my daily supplement regimen that is anti-inflammatory, I actually take away from my workout perimeter purposefully. Because again, inflammation is what we are striving for during a workout. Like using anything that significantly impairs the inflammatory response to training is something that I think would be more safe to use away from the workout and should be avoided in a peri-workout scenario. And in addition, even if it was advantageous to have these ingredients pre-workout, the dosages of each ingredient, I just don't see logically adding up to anything of significance given the supposedly efficacious dose of S7 is 50 milligrams. Think about how little of powder that is. How could you possibly fit anything meaningful from any of those ingredients, let alone 7 of them, in 50 milligrams? Like coffee bean extract, green tea extract, turmeric extract, tart cherry. If you got any of these products separately as single ingredient products, the dosages would be like multiple fold higher than each of these, you know, 50 milligrams of even one of these. I would be doubtful if it's efficacious. So mechanistically, I wouldn't include this ingredient pre-workout, and practically the actual dosages look, I don't know, like lackluster to me, at least. Next up, we have Peak O2. So Peak O2 is a dietary supplement composed of a blend of 6 adaptogenic mushrooms. Has cordyceps, reishi, king trumpet, shiitake, lion's mane, and turkey tail. It's marketed primarily to athletes and individuals seeking to enhance physical performance, endurance, and recovery. It's designed to improve oxygen utilization and increase the body's ability to manage physical and environmental stress. Mechanistically, this is purportedly facilitated primarily via the adaptogenic properties of the mushrooms. So there's a few reasons why I don't use Peak O2 in pre-workout. One is it tastes horrendous. And we've already been through this with Kana. We're not gonna make that mistake again. Fortunately with Kana, it was like a double no-brainer because the effects were almost counterproductive for what we were trying to get out of it. But with Peak O2, it tastes really bad even at mild dosages. It could totally ruin a pre-workout, unfortunately. At least that's what I've seen. Maybe they've, you know, changed the format and maybe it's more tolerable now. I don't know, but at least back in the day, when I was first looking at this, it was like even just a couple grams per serve is gonna like completely wreck the pre. So that's one thing. In addition, the way these mushrooms facilitate their effects is something that I feel shouldn't be forced as a mandatory adjunct in pre-workouts. Rather, they should be utilized when warranted based on individual brain chemistry. So potent doses of mushroom extracts are not necessarily going to be universally advantageous for all individuals alongside what is meant to be ultimately a stimulating and dopaminergic formula. Like there's a very clear intent with stimulants and nootropics in pre-workouts, in that you're trying to drive aggression in the gym, energy, wakefulness, vigilance, stress resilience, but mainly like you're trying to increase your strength in the gym, motivation, and drive. And that is like a very stimulant, adrenergic, dopaminergic focus, which is not necessarily what you get out of mushroom extracts, and especially a combination of multiple of them. So first of all, space. We don't have any more space. So it's not like I could have, if I was looking at these ingredients, just let's just say the taste was not a factor. If I'm looking at these ingredients in the formula, I cannot see one thing that I could justify to myself taking out like 4 grams of it in order to put in 4 grams of something like Pico 2. It's a really expensive ingredient, first of all. It tastes really bad. The effects are not necessarily the most conducive to what a pre-workout for most people is trying to be. For a certain type of pre-workout, perhaps though. But like the minimum effective dose, at least according to the creators of the product, like the manufacturing company, whatever it is, it's 1 gram per day supposedly. And the maximum dose is 4 grams per day. Like if I'm looking at our formula now, like there's nothing I can see that I would justify putting in like a prop blend too, I forgot to mention. So a poor tasting proprietary blend of mushrooms that would traditionally excel more for supporting cognitive function and neurological health than sports performance, acute energy boosting, or like dopaminergic neurotransmission. Like that is not the main utility of these ingredients. Now, to be clear, I do think that Pico 2 could be useful. You know, lion's mane, and other mushroom extracts like cordyceps, reishi, maitake, they hold a lot of promise. Certain mushroom extracts have been used for thousands of years, and not only for their cognitive enhancing properties, but also potential neuroprotective attributes. And they have very potent effects. So with that said though, in my opinion, I think that mushrooms are best kept siloed in a separate formula. So you can choose to manipulate your dosages of dopaminergics, cholinergics, stimulants separately from what is your mushroom extracts, and tailor your nootropic stack to your own individual brain chemistry rather than forcing it into the pre-workout. So this is why we have our mega-dosed shroom formula as a separate product entirely, because it features dosages of lion's mane at the maxed out dosages found in the clinical literature that actually show to be efficacious, as well as other mushrooms at their efficacious dosages as well. If I take 4 grams of Pico 2, first of all, I have no idea how much of each mushroom I'm getting. It's a prop blend ultimately. And that's fine if you're just trying to get a full suite of those mushrooms in, and you know, the general effects of the blend in Pico 2 you like anecdotally, and the data is compelling enough to you, like that's fantastic, great, by all means. Like personally though, like I want more control over my nootropics. I want to know how much of each mushroom I'm getting, especially when there's 6. You know, like lion's mane is listed as, looks like the 5th ingredient of the 6 on the supplement facts for Pico 2. So like from that, I would extrapolate out that per gram of Pico 2, the second lowest dosed ingredient is lion's mane at an undisclosed dosage. So if I'm getting, you know, if I'm trying to get the 3.2 gram dose of lion's mane per day shown in recent literature to support cognitive function, attenuate cognitive deterioration, I can only get that by taking it separately or in a transparent formula. With Pico 2, like at least based on what I'm seeing, I would probably need to take 20 to 30 plus grams of Pico 2 to hit that 3.2 gram lion's mane dose, which I'd never stomach. And also more importantly, I just have no idea like when I'd actually hit the dose of each mushroom that I'm like trying to hit. So it's just like too much uncertainty for me with this kind of a 6 mushroom blend. I'd rather take them separately or in a transparent formula, know the dosage of each, and just like basic mathing it out. Hey, let's see, if I'm extrapolating out this blend, it might look something like this. So like we have 2 grams of Pico 2, let's just say it's an effective dose, assuming it is. This is like a typical amount found in pre-workouts as far as I know. So of those 2 grams, you need it to be split across 6 mushrooms, right? So cordyceps, reishi, king trumpet, shiitake, lion's mane, turkey tail. That's like the descending order of concentration. So just like rough ballpark, back of the napkin math, I'm thinking cordyceps is probably like, 600 to 800 milligrams of the 2 grams at the top. Reishi is probably like 400 to 600. King Trumpet, 300, 400. Shiitake, 200 to 300. And that leaves lion's mane at like 100 to 200. Turkey tail maybe at 100 to 150 to 200. These ranges could be, are ballpark, but they're probably like within the scope of something realistic of what it actually is. And like to me, like if I'm trying to get even just one serving of this in, for example, transparently dosed, you know exactly what you're getting. I'm getting per one serving 3,200 milligrams of lion's mane, 1,500 milligrams of cordyceps, 1,500 milligrams of reishi, 500 milligrams of maitake. Like I know what I'm getting and I can tailor it accordingly. Like if that ratio is not ideal, at least I know as a consumer too, like, oh, that's too much lion's mane for me. I would rather, lean more in the cordyceps direction or vice versa. This is a research-backed ratio of mushrooms at efficacious dosages purposefully included in these ratios. But at least you would know as the consumer, like this is what I want or don't want. So I can avoid it or I can get it based on that. Versus with Pico 2, I'm just kind of like, you're kind of just banking on the fact that it's going to enhance performance in the gym because that's, I guess, what it's marketed for, and you're just trusting the prop blend is ideal. So, like realistically, if Pico 2 really had as much impact as their funded studies claim they do, we can discern ourselves that cordyceps and reishi are probably the heavy-hitting ingredients based on the positioning on the prop blend. And from that, we can then also discern there's probably no more than 750 milligrams of each of those 2 mushrooms in a 2-gram serving, and probably no more than 1,500 milligrams of each of those 2 mushrooms in a 4-gram serving, which is what is imparting these significant performance-enhancing effects, supposedly. So if I want to get a high dose of the primary mushrooms that overlap, like the cordyceps, the reishi, like I could just go buy those separately on Amazon. It doesn't look like there's any sort of like extract that they're standardized to something in this. It's just kind of like these ingredients at those dosages. So like personally, I'm just going to take the shroom product if I want to get that. Or if I was trying to get specifically like the topped out dose of cordyceps, like I'm just going to go buy like a gram, like 750 milligram capsules of cordyceps and probably get like, I don't know, 70% of the benefit of Pico 2 probably. That's what I would be thinking. So I don't know. This ingredient, it's possible they have like standardized to something very specific and it's like a pre-selected and very specifically sourced blend of mushrooms. But at least the last time I looked at Pico 2 on the label, it did not indicate that it was anything other than just, this is a combination at undisclosed dosages of these mushrooms, not that we standardize them to some certain amount of fill in the blank yield. So anyway, I don't know. That's just my like high level take on Pico 2, but I could be totally wrong on it as well. But didn't make sense for me in a pre-workout personally. Next up, Elevate ATP and Peak ATP. So these are, the 2 primary like ATP boosting ingredients that are branded and hyped up. Elevate ATP is made from a blend of ancient peat, fossilized plants, and apple extract. Elevate ATP purportedly works by stimulating the body's natural ATP production via its bioactive compounds supporting mitochondrial function, subsequently boosting ATP synthesis within cells. And then peak ATP, another ingredient, is a patented form of adenosine 5-triphosphate disodium ATP and purportedly provides a direct source of ATP that can be absorbed and utilized by the body. Now, I consulted with Hector Lopez on these ATP enhancing ingredients as well. They interested me for their viability in a pre-workout specifically, and he had a lot of experience with them. He had been evaluating both of them under controlled conditions, as well as collecting anecdotes from formulating and using them for over half a decade. So I took notes on what he had told me, and my primary takeaways from the discussion that essentially dissuaded me from using either of these ingredients unless I could be convinced otherwise in the future was the following. So for Elev ATP, the Elev ATP human data is quite underwhelming when you unpack it, as these snapshot elevations in blood ATP levels tell us very little about actual bioenergetics and true ATP/energy status. There's no muscle tissue or MR spec data of CNS or skeletal muscle or any energetically demanding tissue. It's just blood ATP level snapshots. The premise is flawed from the outset based on the research question they are looking to answer, actual research design flaws, and the claims they go in to make based on data that doesn't quite substantiate them. True improvements in ATP status would require either an amplification of one of the core energy systems, their component enzymes, substrates, intermediates, regulation, transport proteins, or receptor signaling, gene expression, etc., ATP/phosphagen or intermediates in cytosol and mitochondrial outer membrane buffer, glycolytic/lactate within cytosol and or TCA cycle efficiency, plus intermediates, oxidative phosphorylation/electron transport chain components. Nothing about L of ATP or peak ATP for that matter at their doses suggests this to be the case. Perhaps L of ATP bioactives would enhance bioenergetics of, say, mitochondria, but unlikely at the dosage being used in dietary supplements. I'm pretty sure L of ATP is like in the hundreds of milligrams, the low hundreds if I recall correctly. And then I think peak ATP is at 400 milligrams. And then Hector's notes on peak ATP were, cannot be orally bioavailable for similar reasons that oral NAD plus is not bioavailable. Too bulky, too heavily charged nucleotide molecules without specific transport proteins along GI tract. However, it does likely get hydrolyzed into free adenosine, which in itself is a vasodilator and is the likely mechanism for any ergogenic benefit noted in the data. So at least my takeaways from the discussion were that if I had to choose, it seems like peak ATP would be a better choice of the two branded ingredients. But in general, my takeaway on ATP boosting supplements was that there may be something here to dig into more, but it's not low-hanging fruit and not a vector to lean on as reliable with predictable outcomes. And the limited space in our pre-workout would be optimally allocated elsewhere. But this is a category that I will probably revisit in the future. Next up, nitrates. So why didn't we include those? Very effective ingredient because it is already in nitric. And this is one of the differentiating factors of nitric that makes it like the standout vasodilating formula. Also, Vasodrive AP, exact same reason, also in nitric. If you want to get the maxed out vasodilation potential formula, that's what you would use. And that's it. I think that pretty much covers most of like the main branded or commonly used generic ingredients that I would speculate, or at least I, looked at seriously and then, considered otherwise. And yeah, hopefully that was informative, educational. You guys enjoyed that. I have no idea how long this video is at this point, but I've been up. I think I started filming like, it is late, man. Holy shit. The sun is like up now. It's probably bright now in the video compared to, like it definitely is. It's literally the sun is up versus it was dark when I started filming. So anyways, a lot of time and effort has gone into making our pre-workouts as impactful, potent, innovative, and great tasting as possible. And that is reflected in several of the upgrades in Gorilla Mode, like the effects of the original Gorilla Mode formula, the effects that it's renowned for. You can expect as well in the new formula, a massive increase in nitric oxide, NO levels, intramuscular hydration, energy, focus, and as significant of a boost in muscle strength and endurance as you can get from a legal, like non-hormonal pre-workout. Beyond the massive improvements to the formula, the substantial upgrades to the flavor systems as well, and grittiness, I think tie it all together. And give it a try. It's now available on the Gorilla Mind website, and I do want to thank you guys for your continued support all these years. This company, my channel in general, wouldn't be where it is without you guys. And, I think a lot of this was stemmed off the back of, the OG content with the OG formulas and some of those breakdown videos. And hopefully you guys liked this one, found it educating, informative, entertaining. Definitely gonna have timestamps on this one. It's, the old video has timestamps now as well, by the way. I think it did on day one, but I mean, this video is a doozy. This might be the longest video I've ever made. We'll see. So anyways, thank you guys. Wouldn't be here without you. And I think you guys will really enjoy the upgrades. Check it out. There's a lot of reviews on the product page already too. You can check those out. And yeah, hope you guys love it as much as I do. So a lot of time and effort went into this bad boy. So check it out, gorillamind.com. Thank you guys for watching. Talk to you soon.